Chapter 385. Although the emperor's gaze only lightly brushed past, it landed in the eyes of many observant people in the court. However, at this time, the palace treasury bidding documents had arrived. Fan Xian, who was far away in Jiangnan, had raised his official reputation to a terrifying level because of the 20 million liang of silver. Presumably, the emperor would be happy. Were they going to investigate the Ministry of Revenue's debts at this time? The silver that the Jiangnan Palace Treasury had sent was enough to smooth everything out. Furthermore, if they investigated the Ministry of Revenue at this time, would it appear that they were not giving Fan Xian face? In reality, the officials all knew that the Ministry of Revenue had to be investigated in the end because rumors of the Ministry of Revenue's deficit had spread for a long time. The so-called wind from an empty cave might not be without reason. Furthermore, the emptiness of the national treasury before and after the year seemed to faintly confirm this point. If this matter was not cleared up, the Qing Kingdom's court would not have a stable footing. However, investigating was investigating. As for when to investigate, that would require great wisdom to decide. Fan Xian had just performed a great service. Immediately, these officials jumped out to accuse Fan Jian. It seemed a bit unreasonable. They didn't know what the emperor meant. No matter what, there needed to be someone taking the lead. Thus, after the court had calmed down slightly, an official rose and knelt on the ground to report to the emperor about the Ministry of Revenue's deficit. He spoke with certainty as if how much money was missing from the national treasury had all fallen into his eyes. No one knew where this official got his confidence from. The emperor's meaning was very unclear. Listening to the official's words, he furrowed his brows and nodded. For a moment, the officials didn't know whether the emperor wanted to investigate or not. The officials didn't dare stare at the emperor's expression, so they all secretly glanced at the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, in the ranks. They saw that Fan Jian still had a serious expression. Amidst the solemnity, there was a hint of contentment. They couldn't help but cooperate with this official's composure. The matter of the Ministry of Revenue, after the discussion in the royal study, an edict will come down. The emperor coldly finished these words and announced the end of the court meeting. With a wave of his dragon robe, he moved behind the screen. The officials walked out of the palace. Along the way, they couldn't resist whispering and guessing what the emperor was thinking. That afternoon, in the not very spacious royal study, under the dragon couch, there were a few embroidered stools. The scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, the Minister of Appointments Yen Hangshu, the Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Works were all seated. Next to the dragon couch, the crown prince, the first prince, and the second prince stood respectfully on the ground with their hands hanging by their sides. The emperor sat on the flat couch. With a calm expression, he flipped through the memorials the court officials had presented. Actually, since last night, there had been an endless stream of officials who had begun to send in memorials to accuse the Ministry of Revenue of running a deficit and officials misappropriating national funds. However, after the banknotes Fan Xian had sent, this powerful wave of attention was immediately stopped. The emperor also did not allow the officials to debate this matter in the court conference. Sitting on the embroidered stools, Shu the scholar and Hu the scholar quietly met each other's eyes. They knew that the emperor had placed the matter of investigating the Ministry of Revenue in the royal study to discuss because he wanted to give Minister of Revenue Fan Jian some face. However, why was Minister Fan not in the royal study today? If the emperor truly had the intention of returning to the Fan manor, he should have allowed him to defend himself here. The two scholars' hearts were slightly nervous. Looking at the emperor's arrangements, it seemed to be different from what they had guessed. The deficit of the Ministry of Revenue looked like it was real and not another of the emperor's little tricks. It looked like Minister Fan was truly going to be pushed to the heart of the struggle. Fan Jian is sick. Seeming to guess what the officials were guessing, the emperor didn't even raise his head as he spoke in a quiet voice. However, it was difficult to suppress a faint anger in his lightly raised voice. The officials smiled bitterly and thought to themselves that this chief steward of the Qing court was truly a wonderful person. Every time someone in court accused him, he never did anything. He was too lazy to care about any alliances. He even seemed disdainful of entering the palace to defend himself. It was just such a simple move, to escape from illness. Minister Fan's courage? It looked like it was not as small as people had previously thought. Everyone speak. The emperor threw the memorial in his hand to one side and said, "Regarding the matter of the Ministry of Revenue, what do you all think?" The faces of these elders in the center of the Qing court were calm. Their eyes were on their noses and their noses were on their hearts. Even if they were beaten to death, they would not be the first to jump out and offend the Fan family. Although they all thought that the Ministry of Revenue needed to be investigated for the sake of the court, These people all had good relationships with Fan Jian. In addition, since the entire court suspected the Ministry of Revenue, there would always be someone who couldn't hold back their anger before them. Unexpectedly, the elders all had good self-control skills. After a moment, no one spoke. The royal study sank into an incomparably awkward silence. The crown prince looked at this strange scene and couldn't help but laugh in his heart. He thought to himself that the officials only wanted stability, but they had not expected that this kind of behavior would probably make his father more and more unhappy in his heart. At this moment it was time for him to show off. He quickly coughed and glanced at Shu the scholar. Shu the scholar paused and also felt that the situation was a bit delicate. The emperor had asked a question, yet none of the officials dared to reply. Where would the emperor put his face? He quickly opened his mouth and said, "Your Majesty?" He only had time to say 2 words before the emperor's suppressed anger exploded out. He scolded, "The memorials to investigate the Ministry of Revenue were submitted by you." He picked up the memorials beside him and waved them around, angrily scolding, "At this time, the ones who are acting like dead birds in front of me are also you. What use does the court have for you silent gourds?" The officials in the royal study were afraid. They quickly left their seats and bowed to admit their guilt with bitter smiles. The emperor drank a bowl of white fungus soup and slightly calmed the anger in his stomach. He huffed coldly and waved his hand to indicate for them to sit. Since the emperor had become angry, the limelight was clear. Shu the scholar had a good relationship with the Fan Manor. He felt that he was wholeheartedly working for the public and did not have a personal grudge against Minister Fan. Additionally, he did not want anyone to use the matter of investigating the Ministry of Revenue to attack the Fan Manor. He took the lead and said, "The matter of the Ministry of Revenue is very important. This is where the court's finances are located. Although I don't know where the recent rumors came from or where the Imperial Censorate learned that the Ministry of Revenue owed so much, since there is such a reason, it must be investigated. Let's see how your Majesty intends to investigate." Shu the scholar considered his words and smiled slightly. These years, Minister Fan has always been in charge of the Ministry of Revenue. Although he was an assistant minister a few years ago because the old minister was always sick in bed, the affairs of the Ministry of Revenue were all handled by him. You must know that the matter of the Ministry of Revenue is the most trivial, so the court officials often overlook its importance. Managing the Ministry of Revenue is difficult to achieve merit, but if something happens, it is too easy. In the end, it is nothing more than a hard job. Sir Fan has managed the Ministry of Revenue for many years. Although he has not achieved merit, he has never made a mistake. This is actually a great merit for the court. I hope your Majesty can understand Sir Fan's hard work and show me more leniency. Even if you want to investigate, you cannot be too negligent." With these words, everyone knew Shu Wu's position. The Ministry of Revenue had to be investigated, but it could not become a mess. The Crown Prince laughed coldly in his heart, thinking that Shu the scholar's 2 paragraphs were beautiful. Since he didn't know where the rumors came from, it was hinting that even if the Ministry of Revenue owed something, perhaps it was someone in court who wanted to use the opportunity to do so. Who the scholar also nodded in agreement. The investigation must be investigated. The emperor's face was calm. He asked the Minister of Works, "What do you mean?" A cold sweat trickled down the Minister of Works' back. He smiled bitterly and said, "These 2 years, the Ministry of Works has acted according to your Majesty's edict and the procedures of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. When moving money to the Ministry of Revenue, it has often not gone smoothly. However, official business does not interfere with private matters. I do not think that the Ministry of Revenue is purposely making things difficult for me. Perhaps the Ministry of Revenue really does sometimes find it inconvenient to move." This was a critical argument. If the Ministry of Revenue did not have a deficit, how could it be inconvenient to move? Immediately after, the Minister of Appointments, Yen Hangshu, also clearly expressed his attitude. He was in charge of the examination of officials and the appointment and removal of personnel. Of course, he suggested that the emperor should thoroughly investigate the Ministry of Revenue. If there were problems, he should punish them. If there were no problems, it would reduce the pressure on the Ministry of Revenue. The emperor listened to these officials' secretive words and felt slightly annoyed. He furrowed his brows and used his finger to gently knock on the low table on the couch. Pointing at the thin memorials on the table, he said, "Memorials from Jiangnan. You all take a look." Eunuch Yao calmly stepped forward and accepted the memorials, handing them out to the officials' hands. For a moment, in the royal study, only the sound of the officials flipping through the memorials and the gradually heavy breathing could be heard. After a long time, the officials finally finished exchanging and reading. They raised their heads with shock on their faces. Xu Wu and Hu the scholar met each other's eyes and quickly turned their heads away. Neither of them could hide the deep worry in their hearts. If what the memorial said was true, then Minister Fan's daring was truly too big. Jiangnan Road Imperial Censor Guizheng has written that Fan Xian chose a puppet surnamed Xia to control during the palace treasury bidding. At the same time, he provided a large sum of silver for the Xia person to enter the palace treasury door. On one hand, he allowed the Xia person to snatch 6 of the treacherous path's bids. On the other hand, he allowed him to clash with the royal merchants and forcefully raise this year's bidding silver. The emperor's calm voice rang out again. It was so calm that it was as if he was talking about a topic that had nothing to do with him. Guizheng's suspects were the large amount of silver in Fan Xian's hands came from. The emperor looked at the officials and smiled coldly. I'm also suspicious. Putting aside the matter of Fan Xian allowing his subordinates to compete with the royal merchants for profit, which official can tell me, where did he get so much silver? Xu Wu's throat was dry. He couldn't speak. Only now did he know why so many court officials were certain that the Ministry of Revenue's deficit was enormous. It was because of the Jiangnan problem. The emperor's meaning was also very clear. Fan Xian was able to completely control the situation of the palace treasury bidding and use his subordinates to secretly control the 6 treacherous paths bids. The enormous amount of silver involved in this matter probably came from the Ministry of Revenue, from his father's hands. The officials were silent. At this moment, they were not afraid of offending Minister Fan. They were still immersed in this kind of shock. Looking at the inscription on the memorial, it should have arrived in the royal palace last night. The emperor should have long known that Fan Xian had used some dishonorable methods in the palace treasury bidding. However, the emperor's joyous expression in the court earlier was not fake. The emperor's silent endurance and deep foresight were indeed not something an official could guess. Perhaps the emperor liked Fan Xian earning silver for him, but did not like Fan Xian using the court silver to earn silver for him? Only the emperor could move the court silver. No one could move it on their own. It looked like the Fan family had truly touched the emperor's reverse scale this time. Amidst the silence, the second prince, who had only been allowed into the royal study again in February, smiled slightly and said, "Father, I have something to say." "Speak," the emperor said coldly. A calm smile rose to the second prince's gentle and beautiful face. He bowed to the officials and quietly said, "I have some grievances with Commissioner Fan, but I do not dare to not express my opinion because of this matter. I believe that since Fan Xian is far away in Jiangnan and has the identity of an imperial envoy, there is naturally no one holding him back. However, he allowed his subordinates to steal the court silver for his own use, which is a great crime. The Ministry of Revenue's private transfer of national funds to Jiangnan is even closer to rebellion." This was setting the tone. Everyone knew he was targeting the Fan family, but no one could refute anything. The great prince, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Jiangnan Imperial Censor Guizheng has an old grievance with Fan Xian. Back then, in the Great Hall of the Ministry of Justice, he was almost punched in the back by Fan Xian." After saying this, he didn't continue to speak. Xu the scholar sat on the bench and listened. He thought to himself that this was an opportunity that had to be seized. Otherwise, if it really was as Guizheng said in his memorial, not only would the Ministry of Revenue be in chaos, Fan Xian and Jiangnan would also not have a good ending. With both sides in chaos, who knew how many heads would fall to the ground? The Qing court could not endure such a large disturbance. He quickly followed the great prince's words and said with a smile, "Your Majesty, I am not afraid to speak rudely about Guizheng, but I will say one more thing. This person rejoices in grandiose achievements and has done many rash actions. Last year he was demoted to Jiangnan by the emperor. It is difficult to guarantee that he will not purposely exaggerate the matter and frame people because of his old grievance with Sir Fan Jr." Once the words "old grievance" came out, everyone couldn't help but glance at the second prince who had the deepest grievance with Fan Xian. Although the second prince still maintained a beautiful smile on his face, in reality, his face was beginning to heat up. He glanced at the great prince with hidden bitterness. Since his youth, he and the great prince had a deep brotherly relationship. He completely didn't understand why his big brother had to stand on that bastard's side. There were some things to do today and in the next few days. Chapter 386. After Xu the scholar finished speaking, the emperor nodded his head. Even if he had other thoughts in his heart, he could not say anything at this time. Because of Fan Xian's ruckus at the Ministry of Justice last year, the court had sent the imperial censor of the left far away to Jiangnan Road. The excuse they used was that he was overzealous and had bad morals. Naturally, the words that the emperor had said could not be taken back. However, at that time the emperor wanted to appease Fan Xian. Now the emperor wanted to use Guizhang's memorial to do something. Being blocked by Shu the scholar, he couldn't help but laugh self-mockingly in his heart. He wondered if this was a pit he had dug and jumped into. Isn't there another eunuch who went to Jiangnan? At this time the crown prince jumped out to show his stupidity and chuckled. Father, although we can't believe Imperial Censor Guizhang's one-sided words, once that eunuch comes back and says it, we'll know exactly what happened in Jiangnan. These words appeared to be steady, but in reality they were sinister. How could eunuch ruin Fan Xian? It was all because of a word from the Empress Dowager in the royal palace. The crown prince had confidence in this matter. The emperor glared at him and said in a cold voice, "How can the words of a eunuch be trusted? The ancestral teachings are here, don't forget." The crown prince was timid and didn't say anything more. Serving to the side, eunuch Yao was silent. His expression did not change. Wait for Xueqing's memorial. The emperor closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Everyone in the royal study nodded their heads, thinking that the words of a proper governor had to be more trustworthy. Hu the scholar, who had not expressed his opinion, finally opened his mouth and said, "Since it is so, then the Jiangnan matter can be put aside for now. If there really is such a thing, I truly cannot believe it." Just as the second prince said earlier, if there really was someone secretly moving national funds to Jiangnan for profit, it would be close to rebellion. I believe that Minister Fan is not such an insane person. However, since the Jiangnan Road Imperial Censor and some local officials have sent memorials, the court cannot ignore it. The investigation of the Ministry of Revenue should indeed begin. First, it has to convince all the civil and military officials of the court. Second, it has to wash away the accusations Minister Fan has received. The Qing Emperor still maintained a superficial respect for these scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. After a slight silence, he nodded. Suddenly he laughed self-mockingly and said, "Even if they did something like this, it can't be considered crazy. However, I am curious, have the officials thought about how to investigate?" Although a faint self-mocking smile rose to the corners of his lips, everyone in the royal study felt an involuntary chill in their hearts. They could hear that the emperor indeed had a strong opinion of Minister Fan. However, no one understood. Why had the Fan Manor, which had always been deeply favored by the emperor, suddenly become a place the emperor did not like to see? How had Fan Jian offended his majesty? The emperor's last question made the officials speechless. They didn't know how to respond. There were two systems used by the Qing court to supervise the governance of officials. One was the Imperial Censorate, which was the Imperial Censorate who were used to being flogged. The other system was, of course, the Overwatch Council, which held incomparable power. The Imperial Censorate was an organization to prevent corruption. It had the power to report rumors and memorials. That was why Jiangnan Road Imperial Censor Guizhang dared to report Fan Xian using the national funds without any evidence, allowing it to enter the treasury and competing with merchants for profit. The Overwatch Council was an organization that investigated after the fact. It had great power. After being authorized by the emperor, it could interrogate all the civil and military officials of the court. Under normal circumstances, if there was a problem in one of the 6 ministries, the one to investigate the matter would be the Overwatch Council. They could invite all officials under 3rd level to the square, gray-black building to drink tea. If the matter reached the level of vice minister or minister, they would ask for an edict again to ask for special privileges and investigate one level at a time. The Ministry of Revenue had a deficit. Logically speaking, it should be handled according to this plan. The problem was, presently the Overwatch Council had the director above and the 8th Bureau below. Director Qin Pingping, who was incompetent and terrified all officials, had not personally handled the case for a number of years. In the past year he had basically been in the Qin Garden outside the capital and no longer oversaw matters. Presently, there was an additional position between the director and the 8th Bureau. It was a very powerful and special position. The commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian. Fan Xian already had the power to mobilize the entire Overwatch Council. Other than the appointment and removal of personnel, his power was not much different from Qin Pingping's. If he had the Overwatch Council investigate the deficit in the Ministry of Revenue, the officials in the royal study all shook their heads, thinking if you let your son investigate your father, it would be a miracle if he could find a problem. If this matter got out, Northern Qi Dongyi, and all the people under heaven would probably treat this matter as the biggest joke in Qing officialdom. Shu the scholar smiled bitterly and said, "Looks like we have to have the Overwatch Council avoid suspicion this time." However, at this moment, I don't know how to arrange the investigation of the Ministry of Revenue. The old officials beside him repeatedly nodded their heads. Since they were going to investigate the Ministry of Revenue, they had to investigate it seriously. Regardless of whether they wanted to bring down Fan Jian or wash away the suspicions on Fan Jian's body, they had to be treated with a serious attitude and not turn it into a child's play. At this moment, the emperor laughed coldly and said, "Why not follow the old rules?" This. Shu the scholar repeatedly cried out bitterly. He thought to himself, why must the emperor pretend to be confused about something so clear? After hesitating for a moment, he finally summoned his courage and said, "Your Majesty, Sir Fan Jr. is, after all, the commissioner with full power in the Overwatch Council. If we have the Overwatch Council investigate the Ministry of Revenue and this matter gets out, I'm afraid the impact will not be good." "Then let the Overwatch Council investigate," the emperor coldly said. "At the same time, the Ministry of Appointments, Ministry of Justice, and Supreme Court will send people to assist. You can also choose a leader to take charge of this matter. Since we are investigating the Ministry of Revenue's deficit, how can a few people do it?" The officials in the royal study understood. The so-called sending people to assist was actually just to keep an eye on the Overwatch Council. However, no one understood. Since the emperor had already decided that the Ministry of Appointments, Ministry of Justice, and Supreme Court would investigate the Ministry of Revenue, why did he have to drag the Overwatch Council into this mess? As for the choice of the Minister of Revenue to lead the investigation, the officials were also muttering to themselves. They knew that this mission would greatly offend the Fan family and related officials, but they also knew that if they could actually find a problem, it would be a heavy blow to their reputation under heaven. Weighing the two in the end, no one dared to take the risk and take on this hot potato. Even the Fan family's enemies, the Minister of Appointments and the second prince, were silent. It was impossible to see the emperor's mood. He smiled slightly as his gaze slowly swept across the faces of the officials and his son. In the end, it landed on Hu the scholar's face. Hu the scholar sighed quietly. He knew he could not avoid this disaster. He had entered the capital at the beginning of the year and had been promoted by the emperor to be a grand scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Although he had the protection of his literary reputation from many years ago and his reputation as an official in various places, he did not have any clear achievements in the central government. The emperor favored him because he had only been in the capital for a short time and had not become entangled with various powers. He also wanted to use the matter of investigating the Ministry of Revenue to establish his own authority in court. Hu the scholar was grateful for the emperor's trust and importance. He was faintly resentful that the emperor wanted him to offend the Fan family's father and son. The great prince, who had only sent one sentence and then returned to silence, coldly said before Hu the scholar, "Father, I am willing to be the one to offend people." The emperor chuckled and waved his hand. "You cannot." "What?" The great prince furrowed his brows. "I dare to use my head to guarantee that I will investigate fairly and not be biased. Father, please believe in my loyalty." The smile on the emperor's face gradually faded. "If I say you cannot, then you cannot. You are the commander of the imperial army, yet you are investigating the Ministry of Revenue. Do you want to set an example of the military interfering in politics?" The emperor's last words were said very harshly. The great prince was depressed and could not continue to argue. Although the emperor had always liked his straightforward personality, since he had been given the heavy hat of the military interfering in politics, he could only mumble and retreat. Hu the scholar left his seat and asked, "I am willing to lead the investigation of the Ministry of Revenue matter." The emperor nodded and then turned to look at the crown prince. Coldly he said, "Crown prince, also go. Learn from Hu the scholar. Hu the scholar will lead the investigation. You will be a runner." "I will obey." The crown prince's expression was calm, but he couldn't contain his joy. Although he was only a runner in name, once he sat in the Ministry of Revenue Yamen, who would not fear him, the crown prince of the Eastern Palace? Other than Hu the scholar, he was also a leader. The crown prince was a bit happy. It looked like after the Hanging Temple, his father's indifferent attitude toward him had finally changed. The officials accepted their orders and left. The royal study became quiet again. The emperor took a sip of tea with a grave and stern expression and rose to leave the bed. Eunuch Yao quickly draped a windbreaker over him. Seeing that the emperor was not in a good mood, he carefully asked, "Your Majesty, shall we return to the palace to rest?" "No." The emperor walked out of the royal study and said, "To the little building." Eunuch Yao quickly followed. He didn't say anything, but he felt strange. Recently, the emperor had been going to the little building more and more often. Outside the palace, A few uneasy court officials raised their hands in farewell. Some proudly prepared to go back and announced to their henchmen that the emperor was preparing to take action against the Ministry of Revenue. Some were worried and prepared to return home to think about how to face the future of the court. Some were still confused and wondered how the emperor's mind had changed in one day. "Xiao Hu, come to my manor for a drink or two." Xu Wu was not afraid of anything. He pulled Hu the scholar, who was preparing to leave first, and spoke straightforwardly. Hu the scholar's head was full of complaints. How could he drink? He repeatedly begged for mercy. "Old Shu, can't you see that my luck is pretty good today? I don't have the mood to write poems." These two liked literature and were the leaders of the civil officials. The emperor did not strictly forbid private interactions between officials, so their relationship was very good. Although there was a large difference in age, they often mingled together. Shu the scholar made a look. Hu the scholar's heart jumped and he agreed to this suggestion. The emperor's heart is hard to fathom. Xu Wu's manor was also in the south of the city. It was famous for its seclusion and was not very large. However, the two drunk people were talking under the pavilion. They didn't need to worry about the spring wind blowing their taboo topic out of the wall and being heard by others. Xu Wu sighed and said, "I'm afraid this task of yours will be difficult. It really is following your brother's wishes and losing your sister-in-law's wishes." These words compared the emperor to a brother and the Fan family to a sister-in-law. Inevitably, it was a bit out of place. Hu the scholar laughed loudly and said, "What nonsense? Your surname is not Hu. Have you drunk too much?" "It's not nonsense." Xu Wu's expression was serious. He lowered his voice and said, "What do you think you can do?" Looking at the emperor's intentions, he must find out that there is a problem with the Ministry of Revenue before he will let it go. If there really is a problem with the Ministry of Revenue, what will happen to Minister Fan? Right now, the key question is whether or not there is a problem with the Ministry of Revenue. Hu the scholar's expression became worried. "You've explained Sir Fan Jr.'s personality in detail to me." Looking at his clear-headedness with some ruthlessness and his cultured and refined manner of doing things, in order to stabilize Jiangnan and increase taxes, he moved money from the Ministry of Revenue down to Jiangnan. Perhaps it is true. Regardless of whether it is true or not, in any case, as long as the Jiangnan governor Xueqin does not express his stance, the court will not know the situation over there. As for the Ministry of Revenue's deficit, Xu Wu smiled coldly and said, "The Ministry of Revenue is the yamen that manages money. Fighting wars requires money, repairing rivers requires money, disaster relief requires money, repairing gardens requires money, and opening the spring examinations requires money. Everyone in the world is stretching out their hands to the Ministry of Revenue to ask for money. Adding on to the fact that the princes and officials occasionally borrow some, it is truly a mess of accounts. Throughout the dynasties, how could there be a Ministry of Revenue whose accounts are completely clear? The Ministry of Revenue is fated to not be clean," he continued in a cold voice. "This Minister Fan of the Qing court started as a low-level official in the Ministry of Revenue and has worked in the Ministry of Revenue his entire life. To be fair, the Ministry of Revenue under his rule is already the cleanest and clearest since the founding of our court. Even so, if one truly wanted to find faults in it, how could it not be found?" Hu the scholar slowly nodded his head. He was different from the previous Prime Minister Lin Ruofu and the current arrogant Fan Xian in Jiangnan. Although this Minister of Revenue Fan Jian's hands might not be clean, his conduct was unusually low-key and down-to-earth. In terms of ability, there was absolutely nothing to complain about. His good official reputation was also rarely seen in the court. If such a Minister of Revenue fell in this political struggle, these two scholars would feel it was a great pity. However, this time, it was the emperor who had revealed his intention to have Fan Jian become an official. Why was this? Why is this? Xu Wu furrowed his old brows and straightforwardly asked the question that had been on the minds of the officials in the royal study for a long time. Hu the scholar was silent. Raising his wrist, he raised a cup of strong wine produced by the palace treasury and poured it into his mouth. He didn't speak for a long time. Xu Wu stared into his eyes. He knew that this colleague, who was much younger than him, had judgment in certain areas that was worthy of trust. Being stared at by the other party for a long time, Hu the scholar sighed and slowly said, "When no one expected it, the emperor had this thought. It is truly," he seemed to be unable to find any adjectives to describe this emperor. He could only force a smile and say, "It is truly admirable." The emperor investigating the Ministry of Revenue appears to be because of rumors in officialdom and the doubts in his heart. In reality, this is a good plan to kill 3 birds with 1 stone. Which 3 little birds? Shu Wu's beard was covered in wine as he asked with a lisp. The first bird is, of course, the Ministry of Revenue. It is Minister Fan. If the investigation of the Ministry of Revenue is powerful, Minister Fan will have no choice but to resign and return home. The second bird is the official on the eldest princess's side who initiated this matter. Hu the scholar forced a smile and said, the matter of the Ministry of Revenue and Fan Jian's resignation, how could Fan Xian let it go? Don't worry, the emperor will not allow this matter to implicate Fan Xian. After the matter is over, Fan Xian will still be the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Thus, the Overwatch Council will carry out revenge against the officials on the eldest princess's side. At this time, the emperor will no longer be forced by the palace to be a mediator. Instead, he will watch as all of this happens. He might even act as if he wants to appease Fan Xian and be forced to remove a few officials. Pressure from the palace? Shu Wu sighed. Why is it that the emperor can ignore the pressure from the palace after the matter? Can he no longer continue to be a mediator? The reason is simple. Minister Fan's departure and Fan Xian's anger can all be pushed onto the eldest princess's side. As an emperor, the most important thing is to maintain the balance between the officials in court. Fan Xian's side first lost the prime minister and then Minister Fan. In order to maintain the balance, the emperor will have to cut off a large chunk of the other side. Hu the scholar continued, this excuse, this emperor's heart, is the best method to convince the old man in the palace. Everything is for the Qin kingdom, isn't it? He smiled and laughed at himself. Shu Wu continued to sigh and asked, then what is the third bird? Hu the scholar gazed at him with a not quite there smile. The third bird is you and me. Shu Wu was shocked and said, what kind of explanation is this? You have accepted this order. Everything you discuss in the royal study is fair. Fan Xian is not a muddle-headed person. How could he have a grudge against us? What you said is exactly what I wanted to say, Hu the scholar said. Who told us to reveal in court that we wanted to pull Fan Xian into the cabinet? The emperor's established policy has long been set. In the future, you and I are one side and Fan Xian's Overwatch Council is another. Since we have other thoughts, the emperor will destroy our thoughts. Even if Fan Xian doesn't hold a grudge against us because of this matter, how could he not hold a grudge against the civil officials who have written to impeach Minister Fan? Once this matter comes out, Fan Xian will certainly give up on the idea of a proper official career. And he will no longer have the possibility of sitting together in the Hall of Governmental Affairs. It is just a guess. Shu Wu laughed in spite of himself. Even if the emperor's heart is difficult to predict, there is no need to make it so complicated. Hu the scholar sighed helplessly. It is you who wants to say it. In the end, it will be you who will laugh. These words are enough for the two of us to have our heads chopped off 10 times. Don't go around saying it after drinking. No matter what, I am a scholar. Shu Wu chuckled. It is just to accompany the wine. Suddenly, his expression froze. He furrowed his brows and asked, no, the first bird you said is wrong. You have to explain clearly to me why the emperor does not want Minister Fan to continue managing the Ministry of Revenue and why he is forcing Minister Fan to resign. Hu the scholar faintly sighed. The reason is actually very simple. It is because the emperor does not want to see Minister Fan's face in court every day. The two leaders of the Qin court civil officials fell silent at the same time and sighed in their hearts. They felt unfair for Fan Jian. It looked like it was best not to casually raise a dragon child. Before the two scholars felt wronged for Minister of Revenue Fan Jian, they had also thought about whether or not they should quickly notify the Fan manor of the matter of the court preparing to investigate the Ministry of Revenue. Later they thought about it. The Fan manor had many connections in the palace. How could they not know? So they gave up on this thought. Indeed, not long after the meeting in the royal study ended, Fan Jian, who had said he was sick and had returned to his manor, had already received the news. He knew that the emperor would officially begin an investigation into the Ministry of Revenue in the court conference the next day. However, he was not very worried. His serious face had long lost the romantic air of the past. It was only calm and composed. It is not a plan to kill 3 birds with 1 stone. It is a plan to kill 4 birds with 1 stone. Fan Jian smiled slightly and said to the other side, as an official who has been loyal to the emperor for nearly 30 years, my admiration for the emperor has never wavered. Today's matter is truly admirable. Regardless of whether it was in front of or behind others, whenever the emperor was mentioned, Fan Jian would always draw back his brows, calm his spirit, and respect him without a doubt. The 2 words of admiration in the study were said very disrespectfully. What is the 4th bird? Fan Jian extended his right palm and opened it in front of him. Curling his thumb, it was as if he had learned a wondrous palm technique from somewhere. His 4 fingers pointed firmly and unyieldingly toward the sky. The 4th bird is the Overwatch Council. The Emperor wants to see if his order can still smoothly command the terrifying Overwatch Council organization like it did in the past years, and not if, as he fears, it is already in Fan Xian's hands. Xianer's progress is too fast. Fan Jian thought of his son far away in Jiangnan and sighed. If the Emperor can't even command the Overwatch Council, then the power in the Fan Manor's hands is a bit too great. The corners of his brows suddenly rose frivolously. Smiling merrily, he said, "Furthermore, the Emperor wants to see just what the true relationship between Qin Pingping and me is. All these years, the Emperor has incomparably trusted me and the old cripple. You know why? It is because before Fan Xian entered the capital, the old cripple and I were never on good terms. What he wanted to do, I resolutely did not do. What I wanted to do, he resolutely opposed." Fan Jian's expression darkened. "Now that I think about it, it was probably me and Qin Pingping who suspected each other. We suspected that the other had played a dishonorable role in that incident many years ago. But Xianer entered the capital." He continued to explain in a quiet voice. "The suspicion between Qin Pingping and I lessened greatly. Naturally, the Emperor's suspicion of us increased. Most importantly, Xianer is becoming more and more brilliant. Each time Xianer becomes more brilliant, the Emperor thinks of what happened in the past and sees me a bit less pleasing to the eye. The Emperor is jealous. That is why I am resigning." The Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, finally came to a conclusion. He immediately used a frivolous expression that was rarely seen on his face these days and mockingly said, "However, you know me. I have always been silent and good at acting. But, in my bones, I am a very stubborn and ruthless person." He wanted me to follow Lin Ruofu and ask for my resignation so that no one would shed all pretense of cordiality. However, I refused to resign. In any case, the Emperor always cares more about the problem of faith than his officials. To be continued. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 387. You taught me this. Fan Jian sighed and rubbed his fingers together, feeling the sensation brought by the paper. On the paper was a drawing of a woman's head. Although there were only a few strokes, it vividly outlined the woman's expression and appearance. In particular, the eyes of the woman in the drawing were compassionate, gentle, and mischievous, as they gazed at Fan Jian. The Emperor had the master painter secretly draw your portrait in the royal palace. Fan Jian looked at the woman in the drawing and smiled. "But for me, your appearance has always been clear in my mind. Every time I want to talk to you, I can't help but draw one. I'll draw the mischievous you, the cold you, the sad you, the happy you. So many of you, which one is the real you? It's a pity that I can no longer ask you." Fan Jian sighed and passed the paper to the candlestick to burn. He looked at the beautiful face gradually disappearing into the flames and said in a daze, "If the Emperor and I had not returned to our home in Danzhou to spend the summer, we would not have met you, and there would not have been any of the things that happened later. Perhaps I am still that painter who lingers in the brothel all day." The minister pulled up the corners of his lips and a self-mocking smile rose to his face. "You said before, this world needs the profession of an artist. Unfortunately, in the end, I became the person with the strongest stench of copper in the entire Qing kingdom." The flames on the paper gradually burned to the center, leaving behind only a few black-colored pieces of paper. "You have always treated me as the most trustworthy brother," Fan Jian said in the end. In the end, Fan Jian said, "I am very grateful for your trust, so don't worry. Even if I don't have the ability to change too much, at the very least, I will persist in standing in the capital and watch Xianer gradually grow up." A soft knock came from outside the study. "Come in," Fan Jian said with a smile. Lady Lu walked in with a cup of sour berries and gently placed it on the desk. There was a lingering worry on her face. News of what had happened in the palace had long reached home from Yigui Pin. As the mistress of the Fan Manor, of course, she knew what kind of predicament her master would face in the court the next day. Fan Jian glanced at her and sighed. "Don't worry, His Majesty will not treat me too harshly." A slight resentment flashed through Lu Shi's eyes. She quietly said, "If His Majesty cherished old friendships, he would not have been incited by those thieves to investigate the Ministry of Revenue. Of the 6 ministries, who is clean from beginning to end?" Fan Jian shook his head and said, "You must believe in His Majesty. This matter involves the affairs of the court. Of course it cannot be taken lightly. Madame Lu knew that her master didn't want to continue this sorrowful topic, so she nodded helplessly. Fan Jian raised his bowl toward the lingering smell of burning paper on the desk and said, "To each other." Then he drank it all in one gulp. Madame Lu was slightly startled and thought to herself, "Who is the Lord honoring?" The next day the court conference reconvened. As everyone expected, the emperor harshly criticized the Ministry of Revenue's clumsy performance these 2 years and pushed most of the blame for the empty national treasury onto the Ministry of Revenue. Because the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, still said he was sick and did not appear in court, no one in the Ministry of Revenue could defend themselves. The leaderless Ministry of Revenue officials pitifully endured the attacks of the civil and military officials of the court. The court issued an edict and began to investigate the Ministry of Revenue's deficits these years. The Overwatch Council carried out the specific tasks. The Ministry of Appointments, the Ministry of Justice, and the Supreme Court assisted from the side, and who the scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs led the investigation. The Crown Prince stood to the side and filled in the gaps. There were rumors of an investigation of the Ministry of Revenue, so this matter did not surprise anyone. After this array was laid out, the officials still felt a glimmer of shock. With such a large array, it looked like the emperor truly wanted the Ministry of Revenue to suffer. Who knew how Sir Fan Jr. would react when he learned of this matter in Jiangnan? In the afternoon of that day, the officials of the various departments in the joint investigation began to enter the Ministry of Revenue Yamen. There were also the Jingdo garrison responsible for moving troops and watching over the various warehouses. The first target of the officials' investigation was the problem of the accounts of the 7 departments of the Ministry of Revenue. For a moment, the already lively Ministry of Revenue Yamen by the big locust tree became even noisier. There were many fewer officials who had come to collect money, but there were many more officials who had come to investigate. The officials of the Ministry of Revenue nervously welcomed these officials who had come to investigate with an edict into the Yamen. After a long struggle, they finally made enough chairs for the officials to sit. Then, the left and right assistant ministers reported on the Ministry of Revenue's operations for the past 2 years. There were also people who, under the supervision of the Overwatch Council, began to clean up the accounts in preparation for the investigation. Sitting in the middle, who the scholar and the Crown Prince did not make things difficult for these officials of the Ministry of Revenue. With a few warm words of encouragement, they waited for the specific investigation to begin. It was the officials of the Ministry of Appointments and the Ministry of Justice who had found a rare opportunity to make things difficult for the old masters of the Ministry of Revenue. How could they pass it up? Some threatened them with words and some rebuked them loudly. They made the Ministry of Revenue sound like a place where the world hid filth and not a place that controlled money and grain for the court. Who the scholar couldn't help but furrow his brows. He knew that the leaders of these 2 departments were not on good terms with the Fan family. If he didn't keep a closer eye on them, the investigation would probably become the other party's method of attacking dissidents. Faced with such a grand display and seeing so many important figures sitting in the hall, including the left and right assistant ministers, all of the officials of the Ministry of Revenue felt a sense of defeat and even despair. Minister Fan was not in the Yamen. These officials of the Ministry of Revenue all felt isolated by the officials of the court. They knew that what they were about to face was the biggest hurdle in their careers and even in their lives. The officials of the Overwatch Council monitored the work of organizing the account books. In a moment, they watched as the old officials of the Ministry of Revenue cleared out as many as 7 large bamboo baskets of account books. With great difficulty, everyone carried them into the hall. The Crown Prince was startled by so many account books and said in shock, "There are so many account books. Matching them one by one, how long will it take?" The left assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue angrily said, "Your Highness, there are 7 departments under the Ministry of Revenue that correspond to the finances of the 7 roads. There are also 4 departments for clearing officials that correspond to river works and other matters. There are 3 large warehouses. Shishan Bookstore and 7 other workshops were transferred from the Palace Treasury Transport Company to the Ministry of Revenue's management last year. There are also 17 warehouses near Jingdo. There is also the Baoquan Bureau and the Qianla Hall that are responsible for minting money. As for the warehouse Yamen for water affairs, it is far away in Hangzhou and..." The assistant minister rattled on and on. He spoke for the time it took to drink a cup of tea without stopping. The Crown Prince's mind was confused and quickly waved his hand to stop him. The various officials who had come to the Ministry of Revenue to investigate were all dumbfounded. They had always known that the Ministry of Revenue was responsible for managing money. Who would have thought that there was such a complicated organizational setup beneath it? It looked like it would not be a matter of a day or two to investigate thoroughly. The assistant minister smiled insincerely and said, "Your Highness, the accounts of the ministry are still being sorted out. The 7 large baskets placed here are the accounts of the Shandong Road Money Department. Because a few days ago, the minister ordered me to be in charge of cleaning up the accounts of this road, we were able to move them out quickly. As for the overall accounts, it will take at least a dozen days to clear them out." Rebuked by the assistant minister, the crown prince was so angry that he almost choked on his anger. He angrily rebuked, "I don't care how many accounts you have or how many days it will take, but since His Majesty has ordered an investigation, you better move quickly. Otherwise, don't blame me for secretly resisting the order to investigate." Who would have thought that the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue would still carelessly say, "Your Highness the Crown Prince"? This lowly official naturally does not have this kind of courage. However, since the officials have come to investigate on the Emperor's orders, we must draw up a plan. Which department should we start investigating? Other than the accounts, when will we start investigating the amount of silver in the treasury? A few million liang of silver, even if we want to count it, it will probably take a few days. The crown prince angrily waved his sleeve. He couldn't be bothered to argue with this picky official. In any case, when the problem was found, there would be consequences for them. Who the scholar watched coldly from the head seat and felt it was strange. Under Minister Fan's management, the Ministry of Revenue was indeed different from the other ministries. Although the assistant minister was not a minor official, it was interesting that he dared to contradict the crown prince like this. He knew that the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue was angry and couldn't resist smiling and explaining, "Assistant minister, use words are not wrong. Since it is an investigation, it must be carried out in an orderly manner. Furthermore, it is best not to interfere with the daily work of the Ministry of Revenue. The government affairs of the entire country all require the transfer of money from the Ministry of Revenue. If for the sake of an investigation, it disturbs the administration of the Ministry of Revenue too much, presumably, the Emperor would not want to see it." This assistant minister, surnamed Yu, was clearly much more respectful toward Hu the scholar. He bowed and said in an even voice, "I will listen to all your instructions." Since they didn't know where to start the investigation, they had to first sort out all of the accounts of the Ministry of Revenue and then send specialized officials to verify them. The Overwatch Council, Ministry of Appointments, and Supreme Court all had such capable people. However, looking at it, it would be at least the day after tomorrow before they could start. An official suddenly said to Hu the scholar, "In my opinion, why don't we first take out the accounts of the Treasury and the Jiangnan Department to have a look?" The entire hall was silent. The Treasury stored silver from the National Treasury. If the Ministry of Revenue truly moved the Treasury silver to Jiangnan, according to the deductions of all the civil and military officials in court, it would certainly go through the accounts of the Jiangnan Department. This official straightforwardly proposed to first check the accounts of the Treasury and the Jiangnan Department. It was clearly directed at this rumor. Hu the scholar was slightly startled and couldn't find any reason to object. Furthermore, he did want to know if the Ministry of Revenue was truly daring enough to privately move national funds to Jiangnan. He discussed it with the Crown Prince and then ordered the officials of the Overwatch Council and the Ministry of Revenue to first check the accounts of these two departments. The night passed uneventfully. The second day passed uneventfully. The third day passed uneventfully. From the beginning, the Qing Court's investigation of the Ministry of Revenue had sunk into the boundless ocean of battle over accounts. The officials who wanted to find something wrong with the Ministry of Revenue were instantly drowned out by the accounts that were as numerous as a mountain of snow. In the spacious hall, the accounts were piled into a small mountain. The smell of old paper hung in the air, making it difficult for the investigating officials to breathe. Their eyes were filled with yellow paper and numbers that made them dizzy and confused. In the quiet investigation hall, there was the endless sound of pages flipping, the clattering of abacuses, and the occasional sound of tea being sipped. When the silence mixed with the monotonous, repetitive sounds, it was easy to hypnotize. Although the investigating officials sitting in the grand chairs did not have to personally face the terrifying and complicated numbers, they still felt physically and mentally tired and very sleepy. The investigating officials of each department had been busy for a few days, comparing the numbers on the accounts. Still, no problems had occurred. Currently, they were investigating the numbers of the Treasury and the Jiangnan Department. For the time being, they had not found anything that could be used against the Ministry of Revenue. This surprised everyone. Even Hu the scholar, who was secretly leaning toward the Fan family, felt it was strange. With so many accounts, even if it was not intentional, even if it was unintentional, there had to be some mistakes, right? With such a large amount of calculation work, did the Ministry of Revenue not make a single mistake these 2 years? It was said that when the water was too clear, there would be no fish. When the accounts were too clear, there would be falsehoods. It was impossible for such perfect accounts to exist in this world. If there was, then it had to be fake accounts. Who the scholar thought this way. The investigating officials of the Ministry of Appointments and the Ministry of Justice also thought this way. Thus, they investigated with increasing vigor. As long as they could find a single flaw, they could move the whole body and drag the entire Ministry of Revenue down. After this warm but tedious afternoon ended, the officials buried in the accounts of the various departments raised their heads and glanced at each other with astonishment. They then shook their heads at their respective superiors, causing countless feelings of disappointment to surge in the hearts of the investigating officials. There was no problem, at least there was nothing wrong with the accounts of the Ministry of Revenue in the Jiangnan Department and Treasury. The Ministry of Revenue that had been investigated was very clean, abnormally clean. It was as clean as a naked virgin after a bath. Something's wrong. The Minister of Appointments, Yan Hangshu, who had hurried to the Ministry of Revenue this afternoon, shook his head and said to Hu the scholar beside him, "This is too abnormal." Hu the scholar nodded. Yan Hangshu narrowed his eyes and thought for a bit. Of course, we won't be able to find any problems just by investigating the accounts of these two places. Some people are not idiots. They clearly know that the court is suspicious of this area. Of course, they have to smooth out the accounts in this area. However, all of the accounts and treasury are under our control. The items and numbers have to match up. If there really is a problem with the Ministry of Revenue, then it must be done by transferring silver and smoothing things out. I think our next step is not to just focus on these places. We should expand outwards and investigate the 7 departments and the 3 great treasuries. All of the accounts have to be gathered together and investigated. We will certainly find something fishy within. Hu the scholar furrowed his brows and said, "Putting aside the fact that it is too difficult, it will take a long time." The Crown Prince listened at the side. A strange feeling suddenly welled up in his heart. Did none of the officials beside him profit from the treasury under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Revenue? How could they all be so daring as to expand the scope of the accounts limitlessly? He thought about it and agreed with Yan Hangshu's suggestion. Being able to deal with the Fan family was what he hoped to see the most. The news of a complete accounting spread quickly from the Ministry of Revenue to the Fan manor. Fan Jian, who claimed to be ill in bed, did not change his expression. He only said to himself, when an artist makes false accounts, he has to strive for perfection. Go ahead and investigate. The wider the better. The bigger the problem you find, the better. Busy being sick, busy buying tickets, busy packing and going home tomorrow, both physically and mentally exhausted. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 388. I don't know why the people of Guangzhou like Cat so much. Or is there someone in Hubei who doesn't want him to go home? Due to the heavy snow, the plane can't take off. Student Cat is still hanging out at the Guangzhou airport. According to the worst-case scenario, the plane can't take off today, or even if it can take off, it'll be very late when he gets home, so he won't be able to update. The better-case scenario is that Student Cat loves his job and works hard to write and update even when he gets home late. I think this is basically very difficult. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 389. The Ministry of Revenue's investigation continued. Following the expansion of the battle lines and the increase in the number of people invested by the various departments, they finally found some clues that could be used in the old account books. The officials of the investigation group finally relaxed. Regardless of how many problems the informants could uncover in the Ministry of Revenue, as long as there was a good beginning, it would break the flawless image of the Ministry of Revenue under Minister Fan's leadership. The first problem was in the winter coat money sent to Zhangzhou in the 4th year of the Qing calendar. The amount was not large. Moving up from this line, it was like a snowball. The gap that the old officials of the Ministry of Revenue had hidden under layers of cover grew larger and larger. Gradually, it was startlingly exposed in front of the investigating officials. The Crown Prince and Minister of Appointments Yan Hangshu were overjoyed. They did not care at all about Hu the scholar's request to be safe. They ordered their subordinates to dig deeper and deeper. All the way from the county to the capital, they dug up the complicated lines from the root. Gradually the evidence in their hands approached Jingdo. In other words, it approached the bodies of the high-ranking officials who could actually sign. The left and right assistant ministers who had been in charge of being investigated in the Ministry of Revenue also began to tremble in fear. This account for the winter coats had originally been planned and something they had looked over. However, they had not expected that behind a mere 100,000 liang of silver winter coat, so many things would be pulled out. Regardless of whether it was the court or the merchants, when they did accounts, they were best at shattering large gaps into countless small pieces of paper and then scattering them into the large projects. Like salt in a raging snow or water in a flood, they would disappear without a trace. No one had thought that the burden of scattering the winter coats would not be done properly. Instead, it would give the game away. The left and right assistant ministers stayed at the Ministry of Revenue Yamen all night with ashen faces. When they were off duty that day, they were prepared to ignore the discussion and go to the minister's manor to find an idea. Unexpectedly, the Crown Prince coldly said that before this matter was fully investigated, the officials of the Ministry of Revenue should not leave without permission. At the same time, he had moved the Overwatch Council and a few trusted aides to keep an eye on these two assistant ministers. Ever since Fan Jian entered officialdom, he had always worked in the Ministry of Revenue. Regardless of how the name of the Ministry of Revenue changed before and after the new policies, or how the structure of personnel in court changed, he had worked his way up from a small position. 9 years ago, he was already the left assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue. At that time, the minister of the Ministry of Revenue was old and sick at home. The emperor favored Fan Jian, but it was not convenient for him to skip ranks to promote him. Thus, he forcibly had the sick old minister occupy the position and did not allow other factions to send people in. This made it convenient for Fan Jian to use the position of assistant minister to command the entire Ministry of Revenue. In the blink of an eye, 9 years had passed. During these 9 years, the Qing emperor had favored the Fan manor greatly. Fan Jian had also used these 9 years to turn the entire Ministry of Revenue into an interest group that was as solid as a metal plate. It was a very quiet and unostentatious interest group. So when the investigation of the Ministry of Revenue began, all of the officials in the Ministry of Revenue looked up at their minister. They knew that as long as the minister did not fall, nothing would happen to them. Now the Ministry of Revenue seemed to have sunk into danger. The left and right assistant ministers were unable to enter the Fan manor. For a moment, the officials of the Ministry of Revenue were fearful and uneasy. The left and right assistant ministers could not come, but Fan Jian had been in the Ministry of Revenue for a long time. He completely understood the tense situation these 2 days. That night, he knew that the Crown Prince and the officials investigating had found a fatal weapon in the Ministry of Revenue, the winter jackets of the northern soldiers. That won't move me. Fan Jian sat in the study and drank some sour berries. Narrowing his eyes, he said, regardless of who goes to Tsangzhou to patrol, the jackets worn by the soldiers are all of the best quality. No matter how useless I am, I would not make an issue of the bitter cold of the Sioux soldiers. Today he was not talking to a portrait. The person sitting across from him was a living person. It was the Fan Manor's assistant, Sir Zheng Tua, who had always been deeply appreciated by Fan Jian. Back then, when Fan Xian was fighting a big underground case in the Jingdo government, the person in charge was Sir Zheng Tua. He had previously been an old official of the Ministry of Revenue. Because he had done things efficiently, Fan Jian had him leave the Ministry of Revenue and use the more convenient identity of an assistant to do things for him. Zheng Tua thought for a bit and furrowed his brows. That batch of winter jackets was not only not defective goods, on the contrary, the workmanship was very careful. The materials used were also very particular. The cotton was, of course, from the 3 large workshops of the palace treasury. The cotton cloth was also a first-class product of the palace treasury. Some of the other accessories were even goods from Dongyi that were used as an exception. The court could not say anything wrong about this, but he wanted to say something but stopped. Fan Jian smiled and said, "You've been with me for so many years. You should know that I do things carefully. However, when I analyze things, I am not afraid to consider the worst possible angle." Zheng Tua forced a smile and said, "However, the materials used for that batch of winter jackets were not bad. Later, when the Ministry of Revenue negotiated the price, they set it very high. The silver transferred from the National Treasury seems to have been a bit too much." "Speak more directly." "Yes, master," Zheng Tua said. "The Ministry of Revenue took a lot of silver from that batch of winter jackets. Later it was all used in other places. Correct. Fan Jian expressionlessly said, "This batch of winter jackets did indeed take some silver. That was because that month's official salary in the capital was almost unable to be paid out. The emperor did not know of this situation, and I did not have the heart to trouble the emperor with this matter. At that time, the silver from the palace treasury had not arrived, and we also had to prepare the rewards for the Western Expedition Army the next year. The ministry had no choice but to take some silver from this batch of winter jackets." He waved his hand and smiled. However, this amount of silver was not large. It was also not used in other places. "Yes, sir," Zheng Tuo said with a face full of worry. "The winter jackets are only one end. This time the court is investigating the ministry. There will be more and more things like this. Once the matter of transferring silver to fill in the deficit is brought to the capital, I'm afraid, it will ultimately point to the batch of silver that the ministry finally transferred to Jiangnan." Fan Jian sighed and shook his head. "There is no other way. The main reason for transferring silver to Jiangnan this time is for the palace treasury bidding. This does not have much to do with Anji. However, as the Minister of Revenue, I also want the palace treasury's income to be a bit better. If the court does not take money to go against the Ming family, how could the Ming family be willing to take out so much silver?" He lowered his head and quietly said, "Actually, at the very beginning, I had already entered the palace to talk to the emperor about the transfer of this batch of silver." The study was deathly silent. Zheng Tuo was dumbfounded and couldn't speak for a moment. The excuse for investigating the Ministry of Revenue was that the Ministry of Revenue was secretly transferring national funds to Jiangnan for profit. Who would have thought that the palace actually knew about this large transfer of silver? He calmed down with great difficulty and furrowed his brows. "Master, since it is something that the emperor has tacitly agreed to, let's make it clear." Fan Jian shook his head firmly. "The emperor has his own difficulties. If the matter of the court secretly harming the wealthy Ming family in Jiangnan gets out, their reputation will be too ugly. However, right now everyone in court is guessing that matter. The emperor has no choice but to investigate." He sighed and said, "Since it is so, how can we make it clear? Then what do we do?" Zheng Tuo asked in shock. The meaning of these words was clear. It was originally a matter that the emperor was in charge of. Was it just to quell the discussion and that Minister Fan didn't want to be forced to be the scapegoat? Fan Jian's expression was calm. "As an official, of course I have to share the emperor's burden. The Ministry of Revenue's transfer of silver this time is too big. In the end it cannot be hidden. If in the end the ministry is still found out, I will have no choice but to stand up for the emperor and end this matter. The method the court used to deal with the Ming family was not honorable. Furthermore, there were countless court officials supporting the Ming family. For the sake of the stability of the Qing court, this method, which the emperor had tacitly agreed to, could not be announced to the court." Zheng Tuo's expression was moved and sorrowful. He thought to himself that Minister Fan was indeed a loyal official. At such a time, he was still thinking of protecting the emperor's face and the court's interests. "Sir, resign," Zheng Tuo said painfully. "It has already come to this. There is no need to continue stubbornly holding on." Fan Jian shook his head, his interest waning. Zheng Tuo once again tried to persuade him painfully. "I know you are not a person who longs for wealth. Looking at the present situation, the emperor has long planned to stop investigating the Ministry of Revenue matter after you resign. As long as you resign from the position of minister, it can be considered a conclusion to the transfer of national funds. Presumably, the second prince and the eldest princess will not continue to pursue the matter. Hu the scholar and Shu the scholar will also speak up for you." As Fan Jian's confidant, Zheng Tuo had already suggested this many times, but Fan Jian had never agreed. He faintly sighed and said, "There are some things that clearly can be done and left unscathed, but I just can't do it." Fan Jian lowered his eyelids and said, "The Ministry of Revenue has always been managed by me. The court has been at war for many years and has used up countless amounts of silver. The Great River has also been short of banks for 3 years in a row. In this world, no one knows better than me how empty the national treasury is, and no one understands better than me the current dangerous situation. All of the officials think that it is still a time of peace and prosperity. In reality, who knows the danger hidden under the prosperity? But Sir Fan Jr. has already gone to Jiangnan. As long as the palace treasury returns to the right path, the danger to the national treasury will be alleviated," Zheng Tuo said anxiously. Fan Jian laughed quietly in his heart. If the situation in the palace treasury was not completely under Fan Xian's control, If the emperor was not confident he could turn the situation around in the Qing kingdom's national treasury within 2 years, how could that son of heaven be willing to let him resign? Although he thought this in his heart, his face was incomparably pained. He said, "It is because Fan Xian has just taken charge of the palace treasury and the situation is good that I cannot leave right now." Fan Jian sighed and said, "First, it is because it is a crucial period from decline to prosperity. I don't dare to let go. I still want to manage it for the emperor for another 2 years. Second, it is because of Enji. He appears calm and cold, but in reality he is a passionate and ruthless person. If I truly resign, and it is because of the matter of transferring silver to the palace treasury, given his personality, I'm afraid he will immediately resign from his position in the palace treasury transport company and come back to the capital to seek justice for me." Zheng Tuo's face was full of shock. After thinking carefully, he realized that what the minister said did make some sense. "It's getting late. You should go back first." Fan Jian closed his eyes and said, "As for the matters of the ministry, you don't have to worry too much. Although the sparks of the various departments have been lit and will one day burn me or even myself, as long as I can hold out for one day, I will stay another day. Furthermore, once the fire grows, who knows how many people it will burn." Zheng Tuo sighed and deeply admired the minister's dedication to the public. He didn't say anything more and left the study. He left the Fan Manor and got into his own carriage. Returning to his home, he spread out a piece of paper and wrote a secret letter. He gave it to someone in the manor and then lay on his bed. His eyes were wide open and he could not sleep for a long time. Until today, Zheng Tuo, the Fan Manor's assistant, asked himself honestly and still could not be sure what kind of person he was. The Minister of Revenue Fan Jian actually did not know what kind of person his confidant, the assistant who had followed him for so many years, was, but he knew one thing. Zheng Tuo was not one of his people. Zheng Tuo was one of the emperor's people. However, he didn't know if he had been placed by his side through the Overwatch Council or if he had gone through the internal court. Regardless of which route it was, Fan Jian knew that his every move these years had been watched by that man in the palace. Thus, all of Fan Jian's actions these years had been acted for that man to see, including tonight's painful and righteous analysis. Fan Jian was not Lin Ruofu. He would not be beaten down by the people closest to him. From that night many years ago, amidst the sound of the drums in the west, he had made up his mind. He would never, ever trust a single person in Jingdo again. The Ministry of Revenue had indeed moved a large amount of silver to Jiangnan. Furthermore, the movement of this silver had been tacitly approved by the Qing Emperor. Thus, when the palace was angry because of this matter and ordered the 3 departments to investigate the Ministry of Revenue, Fan Jian was unexpectedly angry and felt a sense of absurd drama. He couldn't help but laugh involuntarily. Of course, this batch of national funds being moved to Jiangnan was not to be used against the Ming family. Fan Jian knew that his extraordinary son had long gathered a shocking amount of silver. He just didn't know where this silver had come from. Fan Jian moving the silver to Jiangnan was actually to cover for Fan Xian. Old Fan's way of thinking was clearly more shrewd and ruthless than little Fan's. He did not believe that Fan Xian could use the excuse of the Yi family's inheritance to convince the emperor of the sudden increase in silver in Xia Qifei's hands. Every time he thought of this, Fan Jian couldn't help but sigh. Fan Xian was indeed becoming more and more daring in the way he did things. He dared to ally with Qing Kingdom's long-standing enemy, Northern Qi. His son was causing trouble, and as a father, he had no choice but to cover it up. In order to ensure that his son's plan could proceed smoothly, the Ministry of Revenue had to put some silver into the money house to ensure that they could withdraw money at any time. This was the entire truth behind the Ministry of Revenue's private transfer of national funds to Jiangnan. In this plan, although the Ministry of Revenue moved a large amount, very little was actually spent. Most of the shares had made a circle around Jiangnan and had long returned to the Ministry of Revenue. Thus, Fan Jian was not worried at all that the Crown Prince and the Minister of Appointments could actually find anything. Other than that, Fan Jian had purposely left some to go to the River Works Yamen. If the emperor wanted an official who did not have any major loopholes to resign, he only needed to create a ruckus and, through clever hints from certain people, have that official resign. Even the treacherous Prime Minister Lin Ruofu had fallen into this kind of arrangement. Fan Jian did not want to accept the emperor's arrangements, nor did he want to return to Danzhou so early to retire. Thus, he let the Ministry of Revenue investigate. Only by muddying the waters could he better demonstrate his innocence. At the same time, he had to use Zheng Kuo's mouth to stab the man sitting on the dragon chair. Only that man believed that Fan Jian was loyal, foolish and stupid, yet indispensable. Only then could Fan Jian continue to stand proudly in this dark Jingdo and watch Fan Xian's growth with the gaze of a loving father. It's all under control, right? Fan Jian carefully glanced at the letter. It was addressed to his son far away in Jiangnan before he opened his mouth to speak. A black-clothed man stood in front of him and bowed deeply. Zheng Kuo and Yuan Bo are the same. They both have no children. They are probably both people of the Overwatch Council. Fan Jian furrowed his brows and said, Yuan Bo is really a person of the Overwatch Council? No wonder my in-laws fell so quickly. The black-clothed man said in a heavy voice, but Zheng Kuo has a nephew. According to my investigations, it should be his own son. However, he was afraid the palace would use this son to threaten him, so he has never admitted it. Fan Jian's brows rose and he smiled slightly. Very good, we can threaten him now. The black-clothed man nodded silently. His hands were placed flat by his side. From the web between his thumb and index finger, there was a long callus. If Fan Xian had seen this detail, he would certainly be able to think of the calluses formed by Gao Da and the other tiger guards from holding long knives for many years. Fan Jian gazed at the black-clothed man and said, Following me, there really isn't much to do. You've been bored out of your mind these years. Don't blame me. The black-clothed man smiled and said sincerely, 11 years ago my defenses weren't strong enough and allowed the serving girls by the Empress Dowager's side to be killed by a madman. I was already a dead person. It was all thanks to you remembering our old friendship and secretly saving me. If it weren't for you saving my life, I'm afraid I would have long been playing around in the dirt. Fan Jian smiled and shook his head. You have this kind of frivolous personality, not at all like a tiger guard. No wonder the emperor didn't like you the most back then. He then said, Keep an eye on Zheng Kuo. If necessary, send his son's right hand to his room. I had been sick for the past few days. Yesterday I took an early flight and left home at 5 o'clock. I arrived at the airport and boarded the plane. The plane flew for a long time. Then the gentle voice of the stewardess rang out, Yichang is snowing heavily. We cannot land. So the plane turned back to Guangzhou. I stayed at the airport and stayed at the hotel to eat Hunan cuisine. Then I was informed that I could land. Overjoyed, I went to the airport again and boarded the plane. The plane flew for a long time through layers of snow and clouds and landed in Yichang, which was 3 degrees below zero. It was very cold. I took the bus back to the city. When I got off the bus I couldn't find a taxi, so I took the bus. It was said that Yichang's Yunji tunnel had collapsed and the entire route was sealed. The bus took a detour to number 403. It was said that there was a traffic accident at number 403. When I returned home it was already dark and I was very weak. So Yichang had snow that couldn't fall. That was why I had these problems. It wasn't because of the heavy snow in Guangzhou that my leader had mentioned when he asked for leave yesterday. If I had known that there would be heavy snow in Guangzhou, then I would have been wrong too much. At that time, Guangzhou was full of sunshine and the sky was blue. I stood in the bright sunshine of the southern kingdom and cursed the snow in Yichang. It wasn't over yet. When I returned home there was a problem with my hard drive. I had already known about this and bought a 250 gigabytes hard drive in Guangzhou, so I didn't think much of it. But when I installed the new hard drive, I was shocked to find that I didn't have a CD-ROM drive. How was I going to install the system? I struggled for half the night. I found my brother-in-law's CD-ROM drive and installed the new system. Then I was shocked to find that I couldn't recognize the old hard drive when I installed it. How was I going to copy the things on it? Don't worry, I still have the USB drive. This thing is good. But in the end I confirmed that the old hard drive was broken. Finally, I stopped updating for the first time since I started writing. I felt a little strange. It was as if some record had been broken, as if the Celtics had finally lost. That I was surprised. When did I become such a hard-working person? I worked so hard that it took me a long time to sleep. I woke up very late today. I could still use my brother-in-law's computer at home, so I had no problem writing. But I was sad and scared. I was scared that the data on the old hard drive would no longer be extracted. There were a lot of things on it. My century of love, my dream couple, my godfather, my alien. The scariest thing was that there were all the things I had written in the past 7 years. Ingxiu roasted chicken, the first draft of Qing Yichang, the beginning, and some small essays like nonsense. The scariest thing was that there were all the things I had experienced in the past few years, including my letters, screenshots, chat records, and archived files. The USB drive was good, but there was only Qing Yichang on it. Qing Yichang was only a small part of my life. The hard drive contained the traces of my life in the past 7 or 8 years. I couldn't accept the fact that they might disappear. So I have to repair the hard drive. I'm feeling very down. Tomorrow I'm going to repair the hard drive. Please bless me, Wuxia. I might have written less carelessly these 2 days. Please forgive me. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 390. The investigation of the Ministry of Revenue made great progress. The officials of the 3 departments pressed forward step by step. Seeing that they were digging deeper and deeper, the Crown Prince's expression became more and more boastful. Occasionally he would reveal a few sighs in his conversation with Hu the scholar. It was unknown whether he was sighing about the purge the Ministry of Revenue was about to face or the increasingly heavy spring. The description of a rolling snowball was very appropriate. In Sangzhou, where there was year-round snow in the north, the winter jackets worn by the tens of thousands of soldiers did not bring much cement to the Ministry of Revenue. Starting from this, they searched toward the capital and dug up a few more stories from the past. All of the clues were gathered at the Ministry of Revenue in Jingdou. The deficit in the discovered accounts grew larger and larger. The wound of the Qin kingdom that had been carefully hidden by the Ministry of Revenue officials was bloodily torn open and displayed for the officials to admire. After the investigation group entered the palace to make a report, they increased the strength of the investigation. Even Hu the scholar knew that the Ministry of Revenue could no longer be protected. If Fan Jian quickly resigned at this time, the court might give the Fan manor some face for Fan Xian's sake. If they continued to confront each other like this, it would not be as simple as Fan Jian being stripped of his position. Although Hu the scholar and the civil officials were also fearful of the Ministry of Revenue's deficit, they did not want the court to make too much of a ruckus. They also did not want the temporarily balanced court to tilt. Thus, through some channels they conveyed goodwill to the Fan manor. As long as Minister Fan asked to resign, Hu the scholar and Shu the scholar were willing to jointly guarantee his safety. However, this was only the officials' wishful thinking. For an old official like Fan Jian who had followed the emperor for nearly 30 years, once he made up his mind, the response he made was extremely stubborn. The Fan manor expressed gratitude for the goodwill secretly conveyed by the various manors. As for the goodwill itself, Fan Jian himself still did not give a concrete response. He did not enter the palace to cry bitterly to the emperor. He also did not send a letter to ask for his resignation. In fact, he was still sick. His condition did not seem to be improving. All the officials knew that Minister Fan was not sick, and so did the palace. But this time, the emperor did not send the royal doctor or eunuch Hong to Fan manor to see him. Perhaps the palace also knew that they had wronged the Fan family, and so they tolerated Fan Jian's act of using his illness as an excuse to complain. For the next few days, the Crown Prince sat in the Ministry of Revenue and stared at the people below him investigating cases. This time, Hu the scholar also had to personally come to watch. The people investigating and the people being investigated were all having a hard time. On this day, there was another breakthrough in the investigation of the Ministry of Revenue. The amount of silver in the accounts did not match the amount in the treasury. The enormous deficit pointed in 4 different directions to 4 unremarkable officials. Finally, he found the specific executor and the specific matter of the deficit. When the Crown Prince heard the report, his eyes lit up, but his expression was incomparably calm. He thought to himself, if I dig up from those officials, won't I be able to eat you, Fan Jian? Once I dug all the way to Jiangnan, the court would remember Fan Xian's 20 million liang of silver, but the corresponding crimes would make Fan Xian unable to bear the consequences. When Hu the scholar heard the names of the 4 officials, particularly the last person's name, his eyes also lit up. His expression was also incomparably calm. He thought to himself, Minister Fan's methods were exquisite. It looked like his and Lao Shu's worries these days were unnecessary. After all, the Crown Prince was young. He did not have Hu the scholar's meticulous thoughts, nor did he have Hu the scholar's photographic memory. Thus he did not see the trap in this. Under the guidance of the idea of pursuing a desperate enemy bravely, he joyfully and without seeking fame, ordered his faction of officials to launch a general attack on this problem. Although the Minister of Appointments, Yan Hangshu, faintly stood on the side of the eldest princess and the second prince, in this good situation and with the Crown Prince opening the way, he was happy to help. He held a small flag by the Crown Prince's side and cheered. Although he did not personally draw his knife, his cheers rang out endlessly. Hu the scholar watched from the side and smiled to himself. The investigation of the Ministry of Revenue had reached a critical moment. In the great hall deep in the courtyard, the Crown Prince's proud laughter rang out. In his hand, he held the official's confession. His body shook and his royal aura flared. A cold light gradually appeared in his eyes as he interrogated the Ministry of Revenue official kneeling in front of him. Speak. Where did the 400,000 liang of silver in this account go? It was late in spring and the weather had become hot. The sixth-level official kneeling miserably in front of the officials was already soaked in sweat. The color of his official robes had become dark red. Hearing the Crown Prince's stern yell, he wanted to cry but had no tears. He thought, I was just a handler. How would I know where the minister had moved this silver to? The Crown Prince saw the official's panicked expression and glanced at him with disgust. He immediately thought of his own goal and could only say in a gentle voice, You were the one who signed the transfer of this silver. You have to explain the way out. The court silver cannot be used carelessly like this. The official could not stand the pressure of extorting a confession and stammered. It was left behind by the vice director of the Jiangsu Department of Clear Officials. There were 7 departments in the Ministry of Revenue. They were managed by a minister and a vice director. They were 5th-level officials. The vice director of the Jiangsu Department of Clear Officials was named Fang Li. He was already a relatively high-ranking official in the Ministry of Revenue. This name, along with the other 3 ministers of the Ministry of Revenue, were all targets the Crown Prince's investigation officials had already grasped. Today they were going to be interrogated in court so the Ministry of Revenue could no longer deny it. The Crown Prince was somewhat satisfied with the 6th-level official's performance, but his face darkened. In a cold voice he said, Go and wait to hear the testimony. The official retreated out of the great hall in a fluster with a sullen face. He didn't know what he was about to face. Summon that person called Fang Li in. The Crown Prince was in high spirits and had no idea that his conduct was already somewhat out of line. As he gave out orders, he did not even ask for the opinion of the nominal leading official, the scholar. In a moment, the vice director of the Ministry of Revenue called Fang Li walked in and bowed to the officials of the various departments around him. His manner was arrogant as if he did not know what was about to happen. The Crown Prince looked at this person's face and his heart suddenly thumped. He felt that this face was somewhat familiar. He thought about it carefully and found that he had heard this official's name before. However, the person had already been summoned to the court. There was not much time for him to think. The scholar and Yen Hangshu still maintained their cunning silence. They gave the entire stage to the Crown Prince and let him play by himself. The Crown Prince looked at the 2 officials beside him and quietly snorted. He thought that the world was going to be his in the future. What did interrogating a few Ministry of Revenue officials count for? As long as he could connect Fan Jian to the deficit in these 4 places and the silver in Jiangnan, even if his current appearance was ugly and he lost the dignity of the Eastern Palace, he couldn't care too much. Thus, he slammed the chopping board and asked in a cold voice, Report your name and official rank. The vice director of Jiangsu Road of the Ministry of Revenue, Fang Li, paused. His lips trembled as he looked at the Crown Prince with a face full of shock. He had not expected the Crown Prince to be so strict with him. His face flushed red. With great difficulty, he raised his hands in a salute and replied, I am the Vice Director of Jiangsu Road of the Ministry of Revenue, Fang Li. The Crown Prince furrowed his brows and had an Overwatch Council official hand over the files he had found these few days as well as the statement of the earlier official who had signed to transfer the silver. He asked darkly, Tell me, where did these 400,000 liang of silver go? It was like Fang Li had been struck by lightning. He looked at the Crown Prince like an idiot, or perhaps, he looked at the Crown Prince like an idiot? He trembled for a long time before he said in a trembling voice, Your Highness, I truly do not know. The Crown Prince furrowed his brows and looked worried for the country and the people. Just to say I do not know. I'm afraid, it doesn't make sense. Fang Li was truly dumbfounded, particularly when he heard the Crown Prince say the word, I'm afraid, with a twist. His heart dropped into an ice cellar. He understood what he heard and saw. It looked like the Crown Prince had not only forgotten who he was, he had even completely forgotten the 400,000 liang of silver. His heart was sorrowful, mocking and helpless. That's right, what was he? He was just a minor official in the Ministry of Revenue. In the past, he had done things for the Crown Prince and drank with him at the same table. Why did the Crown Prince need to remember his ordinary and unremarkable face? What was that 400,000 liang of silver? The Crown Prince of that time liked women, liked to spend money on women, liked to build gardens for women to play with, and liked to reward his trusted officials. Who was the Crown Prince? The Crown Prince was the future master of the country. All the money in the world would be his in the future. If he used it, then he used it. Why would he waste his noble thoughts to remember where the money had come from? Fong Li's mouth was dry. He stared at the Crown Prince, dumbfounded. He hoped the Crown Prince would be able to remember something to prevent this absurd and unbelievable situation from continuing to develop to an unmanageable stage. It was a pity that the Crown Prince did not seem to notice the flirtatious gaze of this Ministry of Revenue official. The work of investigating the case continued. The Vice Minister of the Ministry of Revenue, Fong Li, knew that this matter was too big. Furthermore, it was being investigated in front of all the officials. Once the truth was revealed, it would be impossible to take it back. Thus, he gritted his teeth and refused to say another word. The Crown Prince had already felt that something was amiss. He frowned and looked at this familiar-looking official. He didn't understand where the other party got his courage from. The confession was right in front of him, yet he didn't say a word. Could it be that the other party wanted to take all the blame for Fan Jian? Or rather, there had always been secrets to this matter. At this moment, the Minister of Appointments, Yan Hangshu, who had been watching silently from the side, suddenly slammed the table and yelled sternly, "This bastard has guts. Someone come. Drag him out and interrogate him properly." He turned his head and asked, "Sir, who can we use torture?" The scholar, who had been staring at the ants fighting in front of his shoes, seemed to finally understand what had happened. He opened a pair of listless eyes and said, "Ah? Use torture?" There was no tone to the last word of torture. It was not clear whether it was a question or an agreement. Yan Hangshu raised his hands impatiently and said, "I will listen to your arrangements." The official of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council accepted the order and prepared to go forward and drag the stubborn Vice Minister of the Ministry of Appointments out. Fong Li, who had been stubborn the entire time, heard that he was going to go into prison and heard the words, "use torture." Amidst his fear, he finally couldn't control his nerves. In a shrill voice he cried out, "I have been wrongly accused. I was a scholar in the first year of the Qing calendar. 4 years later I was promoted to Vice Minister. It is all thanks to the Emperor's vast and mighty grace. How could I do such a perverted thing?" A string of words sprayed out, but this person had some ability. In such a tense moment he defended himself. He still only looked at the scholar and refused to look at the Crown Prince even if he died. When Yan Hangshu broke his silence and jumped out to suggest using torture, the strange feeling in the Crown Prince's heart grew deeper. When he heard Fong Li's defense, he felt a chill run down his back, piercing deep into his bones. A scholar in the first year of the Qing calendar? The son of the previous Minister of Rights, Guo Baoquan, a palace who had always been on good terms with the Crown Prince, had been born in the first year of the Qing calendar. Fong Li and Guo Baoquan were the same year. The Crown Prince was shocked. Countless things from the past resurfaced in his heart. In an instant he remembered many things. Back then, because of Guo Baoquan's recommendation, he had lowered himself to have a meal with this minor Ministry of Revenue official called Fong Li. Through the eldest princess's arrangements, he had been promoted twice in the Ministry of Revenue. Later, the Crown Prince had hinted to Guo Baoquan, and his trusted aide and Fong Li had secretly moved a batch of silver from the Ministry of Revenue for him to use. However, a few years had passed. That sum of silver had long been spent to an unknown place. Guo Baoquan had also long died somewhere unknown. The Crown Prince had originally forgotten about this matter and this minor official called Fong Li. Who would have thought that he would meet this person again when investigating the Ministry of Revenue today? Had the 400,000 liang of silver flowed into his pocket? The Crown Prince looked at Fong Li being dragged out of the hall by the Overwatch Council officials with a face full of shock. His mouth began to taste bitter, and his heart began to tighten. He knew that he could not allow this official to be interrogated by the 3 departments. Otherwise there would be a big problem. He knew that he had already made the stupidest mistake. He could not allow this mistake to continue. He glared viciously at the smiling Minister of Appointments Yan Hangshu beside him and shouted angrily, "Wait!" The manner of the Minister of Rights who had been brought down by Fan Xian was nominally close to the Eastern Palace, but in reality he was the eldest princess's trusted aide. The Crown Prince had discovered this fact the night the Crown Prince had recited poetry. Since the other party was the eldest princess's person, then Yan Hangshu would know that he had borrowed money from the Ministry of Revenue through Guo Baoquan. The Crown Prince thought hatefully. It would have been fine if this old man didn't remind him, but he actually wanted to kick him when he was down. "Your Highness, what is it?" Yan Hangshu gazed at him with a slight smile. The Crown Prince was momentarily speechless. He was already riding a tiger. He had single-handedly created such a large-scale investigation. In the end, the investigation had reached him. How was he going to wrap things up? He furrowed his brows and narrowed his eyes. It looks like this official has something to say. There's no harm in asking first. Yan Hangshu smiled and nodded. Naturally, the scholar had no objections. Fang Li had escaped death and knew that the crown prince had finally remembered him. He let out a big breath. However, when he met the crown prince's worried gaze, they both knew that the matter today was truly difficult to deal with. Ruthlessness flashed through the crown prince's heart. He suddenly remembered that Guo Baoquan had long disappeared. As long as he refused to admit it and then thought of a way to make this Fang Li shut his mouth, he would be able to clear his name. Having thought this through, he said with a gentle expression, "Fang Li, you have to think carefully about where this silver will go. I have come to investigate a case under the imperial edict. Of course, I will not let a corrupt official go, but I will not wrongly accuse any good official." A glimmer of hope flashed through Fang Li's eyes. He knew that the crown prince was hinting at him to randomly accuse others. Since this 400,000 liang of silver had been dug up, in front of the scholar, Minister Yen, and the officials of the Supreme Court and Overwatch Council, it could not be shut up again. Fang Li knew that this was the only way. He lowered his head and his eyes darted around. He made up his mind, but for a moment he didn't know who to push it onto. Back then, after he took the money, he had secretly destroyed the account books. However, for such a large amount of silver, it would be difficult to find another name. Yan Hangshu glanced at the crown prince and sighed in his heart. He knew that the other party was prepared to sacrifice a pawn, and this pawn also seemed to be prepared to be sacrificed. He couldn't help but be surprised. How could such an incompetent person like the crown prince make this minor official, Fang Li, so convinced? Earlier, the crown prince had clearly forgotten this person. He didn't understand that in Fang Li's heart, the crown prince was going to inherit the throne. As long as he didn't die in this matter, then there would come a day when he could turn things around. But, for 400,000 liang of silver, how could the emperor spare the life of a minor minister counselor? It was clear that Fang Li had not thought of this. Without letting Fang Li think for too long under the scrutinizing gazes of all the officials, a slightly tired voice had already helped him answer and helped him out of his predicament. At the same time, it put a rope around the crown prince's body. "I remember this debt. Back then the Ministry of Rights sent out an order. Because the emperor had ordered the repairs to the various roads for the autumn examinations and the schools, silver had to be transferred from the ministry. In total it was transferred 14 times. In total, it was 400,700 liang of silver. The silver has already been sent to the Ministry of Rights. The Ministry of Rights should have a receipt. However, I did not personally take care of these matters. I will find out in a moment. All matters are carried out according to the laws of the Qing court. Everyone, please do not make things difficult for these pitiful officials under my command. As for whether or not there is a problem with this sum of silver, we only need to send an order to the various provinces to see the status of the repairs to the schools these 2 years, and we will know for sure." Minister Fan, who had been sick for many days, finally forced his weak and sick body to the Ministry of Revenue Yamen that he had not seen for many days. He leaned against the door and weakly explained each stroke to the officials in the hall. An official of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council quickly went forward to support him. The scholar led Yan Hangshu and a group of investigating officials to quickly stand and bow. Although they were investigating officials, no one dared to show any disrespect. This was the first time this Minister of Revenue, who had led the Ministry of Revenue for 9 years, had arrived at the Yamen. As soon as he opened his mouth, he spoke on behalf of his subordinates. However, he also pointed out the whereabouts of the silver. As long as it was investigated, the truth would come to light. As a result, the crown prince's face paled and his eyes began to wander. "Of course, I still have a strong desire to retrieve it. I won't be stingy on this matter. The things inside are too important to me. Only today did I remember that my dad's diary and notes are also inside." 3 black lines. Looking at the book review section, I'm really grateful for everyone's comfort and suggestions. I'm sure the hard drive's wounded heart is also very comforted. If I can't get it done today, he'll really be eternally dead and can rest in peace in the netherworld. Of course, I still have a strong desire to retrieve it. Then he discovered that there were a lot of people from the same hometown and was pleasantly surprised. He didn't have time to greet them one by one, so he cupped his hands and said, "Let's eat noodles together when you're free. There will be a time for me to eat with you, hee. P.S. I just went to take a look. There seemed to be some bad omens. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, Please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 391. Minister. Sir Who the scholar's face was full of smiles as he welcomed Minister Fan in. The officials responsible for investigating the Ministry of Revenue also gathered around and all expressed their comfort to the sick minister. Even the Minister of Appointments, Yen Hangshu, could not stay out. His old face was full of sincere worry and concern. The people of the Overwatch Council investigating the Ministry of Revenue had long carefully helped Minister Fan block the wind blowing in from outside the door. They were very eager. Regardless of whether or not the court truly wanted to investigate the Ministry of Revenue, regardless of whether or not the emperor truly wanted Minister Fan to resign, as long as Fan Jian was in court, as long as the emperor did not tear apart this layer of brotherly affection, as long as Fan Xian, far away in Jiangnan, was still alive, these officials in court did not dare to slight Minister Fan. Thus, the scene at this moment had an absurd sense of comedy. The Minister of Revenue who was being investigated was being cared for and carefully protected by everyone, particularly the investigating officials of the Overwatch Council. In particular, the investigating officers of the Overwatch Council were all from the First Bureau, led by Mu Tai. The First Bureau was still under Fan Xian's direct control, and Fan Jian was their superior's father. What else could they do? The Crown Prince's face alternated between green and white. Looking at the scene in front of him, a great sense of unease welled up in his heart. Fan Jian had said he was sick and had not come to the Ministry of Revenue for many days. Now that he had arrived, he seemed to have attracted everyone's gaze. This official, who usually did not show himself, seemed to have some kind of aura about him. Although he was the Crown Prince and the future ruler of Qing Kingdom, facing Minister Fan, he still had no choice but to stand up. Piling a warm smile on his face, he comfortingly said, "Minister, are you feeling better?" The Crown Prince was not afraid of Fan Xian or concerned about the Overwatch Council. However, as a member of the royal family, particularly the successor to the throne, he had to display a certain bearing. The relationship between the Fan family and the Li family was too deep. In Danzhou there was still an old woman watching from afar. The Crown Prince did not know what kind of feelings the emperor still had for that wet nurse. Fan Jian smiled shamefully and said, "The Ministry of Revenue matters were all started by me, yet I have to trouble your highness and Sir Hu. It is truly my fault." After exchanging a few pleasantries, everyone took their seats. Although Fan Jian belonged to the side that was being criticized, he had always been targeting the Minister of Revenue. Thus, he openly sat in the middle of the room, not wanting to pass on his responsibility. This was the Ministry of Revenue, Fan Jian's territory. After everything had calmed down, everyone turned their gazes to the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Revenue, Fang Li, who was still in his original spot. Everyone had a different look in their eyes. Yen Hangshu was gloating, the Crown Prince was hesitant, Hu the scholar was cold, and the Overwatch Council furrowed their brows. Only Minister Fan's face was calm. It was as if he had not thought that this person called Fang Li would implicate so many people. At this point, the Crown Prince naturally understood everything. Fan Jian was a shameless, cunning, and silent old fox. When the court began to investigate the Ministry of Revenue, it should be said that as early as a few years ago, when the Crown Prince extended his hand to the Ministry of Revenue, Fan Jian had already been watching the scene with cold eyes. Then he used extremely shrewd and ruthless methods to quietly cover up this matter without anyone noticing. However, on the other hand, he purposely left behind a small tail that did not draw attention. With a light flick, it was thrown to one of the 7 bureaus. In this way, not only did they cover up for the Crown Prince, but they also had the Crown Prince's weakness. Most importantly, this kind of cover also covered up the officials on the Crown Prince's side. Thus, this 400,000 liang of silver turned into nothingness and was wiped clean. It was so clean that even Fang Li thought there were no more problems. In addition, there was the collapse of the Ministry of Rights and a sliver of the Crown Prince's stupidity. In the entire world, only Fan Jian knew the entire process. This minister, with unusual shrewdness, did not directly throw it out to attack the enemy. Instead, he left a trace of the head of the thread in the weeds. For example, the winter clothes worn by the soldiers in the snowy north or the siege machines that were not needed on the South U battlefront. When the court began to investigate the Ministry of Revenue, they would find the head of the thread and gently pull on it. In the end, they would pull on their own belts. This was a trap that had been buried for a few years. Fan Jian did not need to do anything. He only needed to wait for the moment he was threatened and create a certain situation so that some people would grab onto the belt they had long forgotten and pull it hard. A good trap. The investigation into the Ministry of Rites had already begun. Although the Ministry of Rites had undergone a major change after Guiyu was tied to death in the Celestial Prison and all of the documents were a bit messy, under the powerful investigation of the court's investigation team and the Overwatch Council's careful search, the transfer order the Ministry of Rites sent out matched up with the receipt that the Ministry of Revenue had secretly kept. The 400,000 liang of silver had indeed been sent to the Ministry of Rites. The problem was, the Ministry of Rites had moved 400,000 liang of silver to repair the school buildings and the autumn school. Where did they go? Grand Scholar, who had been inspecting all over the world for a long time and then entered the Hall of Governmental Affairs to oversee matters. Of course, he knew that the schools in the various provinces were still broken. In many places the autumn school offices would still leak rain. Thus, his expression became increasingly ugly. He faced the official of the Ministry of Rites in front of him and asked, "Who can tell me where these 400,000 liang of silver went?" Who the scholar lightly turned his body and glanced at the crown prince. He sighed in his heart. In reality, everyone in the hall was well aware of the situation in the court over the past few years. The Ministry of Rites had always been the backyard of the Eastern Palace. The Ministry of Rites did not have the guts to move 400,000 taels of silver around. Everyone could guess that the silver had flowed to the Eastern Palace. However, since the investigation had reached the Eastern Palace, it seemed that this matter would be difficult to continue. Who the scholar was silent for a moment and then said, "The most important problem right now is to find out the whereabouts of these 400,000 liang of silver." The Crown Prince's heart jumped, but he smiled warmly on his face. "Sir, whose words are reasonable." Mu Tai of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council did not have the right to sit beside these officials. He had been standing to the side the entire time. He looked at the expression of Minister Fan sitting in the middle and suddenly said, "The silver did reach the Ministry of Rites. However, the official who handled this matter died in the spring examination case the year before last." The Crown Prince was silent to the side. Guiyu had already died and Guo Baoquan had been lost. Now that the Overwatch Council had confirmed the specific death of the person who handled it, even if the eldest princess knew of his connection to the 400,000 liang of silver, she would not be able to find any evidence to give to Hu the scholar. Thus, his heart felt slightly at ease. While he felt slightly at ease, he couldn't help feeling sorrow and anger. "Why are you doing this?" Unexpectedly, Mu Tai's next words chilled the Crown Prince's heart. In a serious voice he said, "However, there are always some clues that can be investigated. Scholar, do you think we should have the Overwatch Council investigate the Ministry of Rites?" Investigate the Ministry of Rites? Everyone in the hall was startled. They thought, have this group of wolf-like Overwatch Council investigate the Ministry of Rites? If the court investigated the Ministry of Revenue, it would clearly make Sir Fan Jr. far away in Jiangnan angry. If the Overwatch Council investigated the Ministry of Rites, under Sir Fan Jr.'s remote control, the pitiful officials of the Ministry of Rites would probably not survive. However, Mu Tai's request seemed very reasonable. Fan Jian lightly stroked his long beard. His face was expressionless, but in his heart, he was thinking that Anji's trusted aide seemed to have a much better brain than before to be able to guess his thoughts. Fan Jian's thoughts were very simple. Didn't the court want to investigate the Ministry of Revenue? If the Ministry of Revenue wanted to protect itself, it had to open up the battle lines and drag in more departments. The Ministry of Rites was only the beginning. Once all 6 ministries were found to have problems, the wise emperor would not be able to remove all the ministers of the 6 ministries from their positions. The Minister of Appointments, Yen Hangshu, glanced at Fan Jian and greatly admired this old fox. He quickly shook his head and refuted, "The court has clearly ordered to investigate the Ministry of Revenue. It is not good to spread it too widely." Fan Jian smiled insincerely and said, "Reasonable, reasonable." Everyone could hear the mockery in these 2 words of reasonable. Yen Hangshu's face blushed. He knew his suggestion was unreasonable. Since the Ministry of Revenue's deficit involved the Ministry of Rites, they should continue to investigate. Who the scholar's expression was also awkward. He persuaded, "Let's discuss it for a while, let's discuss it for a while more." If they let go and asked for an edict for the Overwatch Council to investigate the Ministry of Rites, in the end they would certainly investigate the Crown Prince. Thus, before entering the palace to ask for an edict, Hu the scholar did not dare to make such a decision. The Crown Prince gritted his teeth and said, "The matter of the Ministry of Rites has to be investigated. However, there is a priority. The matter of the Ministry of Revenue's deficit has not been clearly investigated. If we expand it too widely, I'm afraid it will hinder the emperor's edict. Fan Jian continued to smile slightly and said, "The crown prince is reasonable. Who the scholar sighed in his heart and said, "Concerning the matter of the Ministry of Rights, please enter the palace in a moment to listen to the imperial edict." According to the crown prince's intentions, the Ministry of Revenue should continue. If they continued to investigate, the Ministry of Revenue would certainly find more problems. In the end, the 400,000 liang of silver was only the tip of the iceberg. The crown prince did not believe the Fan family would be so clean in the Ministry of Revenue. Of course, the Ministry of Revenue was not clean. Minister Fan had set up a trap, and the crown prince was not the only one buried in it. As the investigation gradually deepened, a few more departments were successfully dragged into the water by the Ministry of Revenue. The Supreme Court bore the brunt of it. The expression of the long-silent official of the Supreme Court immediately changed. He felt incredibly awkward. The Ministry of Revenue did not have bad accounts, but there were too many hidden accounts. Each deficit pointed to a certain side in the court. In the end, even a small yamen like the Imperial College could not escape. The Minister of Appointments, Yin Hangshu, began to be cautious. Although the Ministry of Revenue had found a problem, it did not involve the eldest princess or the second prince. Because he was on his side, the money always flowed through the palace treasury. But seeing how well prepared Fan Jian and the Ministry of Revenue were, who knew if he would not be so sinister as to use some kind of excuse to trick the second prince? "Let's stop here for now," Yin Hangshu furrowed his brows and said. "After entering the palace to ask for an edict, we'll continue tomorrow." Reasonable. Fan Jian continued to smile as he said these two words. Who the scholar's face was cold. He looked at the officials in the investigation group and thought, how could the court become so corrupt? If the emperor truly had the determination to continue investigating, Minister Fan would have to resign. As long as the investigation didn't reach Jiangnan, he would not have to take too much responsibility. However, the other officials in court would probably be mostly unlucky. In the royal palace in late spring, red apricots occasionally appeared on the low walls of the inner palace. The green trees and beautiful flowers contrasted against each other. The beautiful scenery entered one's eyes and did not want to be taken away. It was already dusk, and in the blink of an eye, it was dark. The door to the royal study opened and closed and opened again, and a few ministers came and went in succession. In the end, there was only the lonely emperor left in the room. There was also the old eunuch and a bright candle. But anger flared in the Qing emperor's eyes. He slammed his palm on the wooden table, but not a drop of tea spilled out. In a cold voice he said, "What a Ministry of Revenue, what a Eastern Palace. Do you really think I don't dare to kill?" The officials who had entered the royal study to discuss matters were the officials responsible for investigating the Ministry of Revenue after receiving the edict. Hearing their reports, the Qing emperor's anger gradually grew. His original intention was only to investigate the Ministry of Revenue and use the matter of the Ministry of Revenue moving silver to Jiangnan to persuade Fan Jian to abdicate. He used this relatively open method to re-establish the balance in court. However, he had never expected that the Ministry of Revenue was much cleaner than he had imagined. Fan Jian was much cleaner than he had imagined. On the contrary, it was the other 5 ministries and 3 temples in court who had benefited greatly from the Ministry of Revenue, particularly the Eastern Palace. Earlier, who the scholar had already secretly reported on the matter of the Ministry of Rights and sadly hinted that it was best not to continue investigating the Ministry of Revenue matter. Otherwise it would truly make the court restless. Before the Ministry of Revenue could bear the blame they deserved, the other officials of the other ministries would probably start eating prison food. While the emperor was angry, he couldn't help but feel chilled by the Ministry of Revenue's methods. That was why he had flown into a thunderous rage earlier. In his view, since Fan Jian had long known about these matters, why did he continue to hide it? It was not until he was prepared to move against the Ministry of Revenue that he suddenly threw it out and caught the officials off guard. Wasn't this also catching him, the emperor, off guard? He and Fan Jian had grown up together, so he knew the abilities of his housekeeper. He was not surprised at the Ministry of Revenue's deep and scheming response. He was angry that the officials in court had failed to live up to expectations and had been tied onto this big boat by the Ministry of Revenue. He was even more angry that the crown prince was so stupid. How could he dare to pass the world to him? Of course, the emperor was even more angry at Fan Jian's sharp counterattack because this comrade was He is threatening me. The emperor furrowed his brows and said coldly. Old eunuch Hong, whose face was covered in age spots, shook his head and sighed. Your Majesty, I'm not afraid to say too much. People are always selfish. Even a loyal official like Minister Fan would have to think of some way to protect himself in such a dangerous situation. The emperor's voice was slightly sharp. With a mocking smile he said, playing with schemes like this is considered a loyal official? Old eunuch Hong sighed and said, Director Chen loves to play with schemes, but in terms of loyalty, I'm afraid even I do not dare to say I am above him. The emperor slowly closed his eyes and said, Qin Pingping has saved my life countless times. How can Fan Jian compare? Minister Fan has managed the Ministry of Revenue these years and quietly smoothed out all the hidden dangers. What? Is it not for the peace of the court? Old eunuch Hong sighed. If Minister Fan truly had any disloyal intentions, the evidence in his hands would be enough for him to do many things. However, he still hasn't done anything. This means that he just doesn't want the court to be shaken. He should at least tell me first, the emperor said coldly. Old eunuch Hong said quietly, based on the news the Fan Manor has sent back these years, the reason Minister Fan has never entered the palace to report in detail is because he doesn't want your Majesty to waste your energy. Your Majesty should still remember the news that came a few days ago. The emperor thought of the news Zheng Ta had reported. His mood gradually calmed. He recovered some of his good feelings toward Fan Jian. He furrowed his brows and said, however, the Ministry of Revenue still has to continue investigating. Otherwise, if it ends hastily, what will happen to the face of the court? What is important is your Majesty's current attitude toward Minister Fan? Eunuch Hong asked with his head lowered. The emperor shook his head. He can no longer be Minister of Revenue. I can give him other compensations, but he can no longer lead the Ministry of Revenue. And Ziyuan manages the palace treasury in Jiangnan. No matter how you look at it, and Ziyuan is not suitable to continue holding the position of Minister of Revenue. A sense of sorrow rose in old eunuch Hong's heart. He felt some sympathy for the minister who had racked his brains these years. Probingly he said, there is something I don't know if I should say or not. Speak. Eunuch Hong said in a slightly sharp voice. Sir Fan Jr. is a genius. Your Majesty has arranged for him to take over the palace treasury and the Overwatch Council. As for Minister Fan, according to common sense, he should indeed no longer be in charge of the Ministry of Revenue. Perhaps your Majesty still remembers that in the first year of the Qin calendar, Fan Jian, who was still an assistant minister at the time, had once made a ruckus with Director Qin in this royal study. Minister Fan, in his bones, does not wish for Sir Fan Jr. to control the Overwatch Council. Continue. The emperor furrowed his brows tightly. He knew what eunuch Hong's words implied. After all, Minister Fan was once a distinguished scholar, eunuch Hong said with a slight smile. Old eunuch Hong smiled slightly and said, he is an affectionate person. I have always thought that any affectionate person can become someone's fetters. With Minister Fan staying in the capital and Sir Fan Jr. acting in Jiangnan, it will be much safer. The emperor's expression was calm. A moment later he said, earlier in the Empress Dowager's palace, the Empress Dowager also said the same thing. First, for the sake of Danzhou's mother, the palace has to give the Fan Manor more support. Second, if Fan Jian stays in the capital, Fan Xian will indeed feel more at ease doing things in Jiangnan. What did it mean to feel at ease? It was nothing more than a secret precaution and threat. He can be a duke or a marquis. The emperor finally said with a cold face. I will not mistreat the Fan family, but I will also not let the matter of the Ministry of Revenue end like this. Using the title of duke and marquis to trade for the position of minister, it was unknown whether Fan Jian would be at a disadvantage or gain an advantage. In the Fan Manor, Fan Jian closed his eyes and drank a sour berry, enjoying Lady Lu's massage from behind him. He sighed and said, I'm afraid the emperor will mistakenly think I am threatening him. That won't be good. Lady Lu's expression darkened slightly. She knew this matter would be difficult to resolve. Although the palace would not go too far toward the manor, it looked like the old master would eventually have to step down from the position of Minister of Revenue. The emperor's intentions had already, through Yi Guipin, once again accurately and cautiously reached the Fan Manor. These few days, the Ministry of Revenue's investigation continued unhappily. It had implicated even more people, turning the entire court into a pool of muddy water. The civil and military officials were all panicking. The Overwatch Council had already arrested a number of people, and the Ministry of Revenue itself had also been found to have some problems. However, the efforts of some factions had not yet achieved results. No one had been able to uncover the secret silver route between the Ministry of Revenue and Jiangnan. Many people, including the eldest princess, began to feel a strong sense of unease. Was the silver fan xian used in Jiangnan truly not from the Ministry of Revenue? As long as there was no major crime, even the emperor could not forcefully ask Fan Jian to resign and confess. The summer flood is about to arrive. Fan Jian smiled slightly. The court needs silver, so the matter of investigating the Ministry of Revenue will slow down. I will waste it with the emperor. As long as it lasts until Fan Xian returns to the capital next year, there won't be much of a problem. Lady Lu smiled. Only now did she know that what the old master had been waiting for was nothing more than a flood that the heavens would send down. Using the might of heaven against the might of heaven, the emperor was not an incapable ruler. He knew which was more important. I just don't know what the situation is on Fan Xian's side, Fan Jian said with some worry. Fan Jian said with slight worry, transferring money to the river works took away a lot of his confidence. The Ming family is not so easy to swallow. Still tangled with the hard drive. Thank you for everyone's concern. Also, Ying Xiu was written by me. I can't make money so I stopped. I thought everyone already knew this. P.S. The female section is currently holding a selection for the best works of the year. Presumably there are many brothers and sisters who read books who are monthly subscribers. Please vote for what I wrote at the end of the tunnel. Even immortals have Jianghu. Thank you everyone. To be continued. If you want to know what happened after, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 392. The rain continued to fall. The flowers in various gardens in Jingdo had long bloomed. They gradually fell and sank into the mud. As for the matter of investigating the Ministry of Revenue, the palace was still waiting for a result. This made things difficult for the officials in court. At this point, the officials knew that if anyone wanted to bring down the Ministry of Revenue, they themselves had to fall first. There was no need for Sir Fan Jr., who was far away in Jiangnan, to speak. Sir Fan Sr., who was in the capital, had already displayed enough trump cards. No matter how they investigated, they couldn't find themselves. Who would want to do such an idiotic thing? Furthermore, the Crown Prince had already foolishly given a very good demonstration. In officialdom, the most important thing was the Emperor's golden words. The second most important thing was the so-called unwritten rules. Currently, the Ministry of Revenue was swaying between these two matters. However, no matter how it swayed, it stubbornly held on and refused to fall. Fan Jian refused to resign and end this matter. Even though there were rumors in the palace that the emperor was prepared to use a rarely seen high rank to express compensation, the Fan family still stubbornly held on. For a moment, the officials in the capital couldn't help but admire Fan Jian's confidence in the depths of their hearts. In reality, Fan Jian did not stubbornly hold on. After the Ministry of Revenue had implicated enough officials and the Crown Prince began to turn his gaze to other areas, such as protecting himself and dragging a few of his brothers into the water, the Minister of Revenue did not return to the Ministry of Revenue Yamen. Instead, he began to leisurely drink tea in his manor, go to the manor to look at the mountains and rivers, and occasionally visit the manors he was on good terms with. It was not convenient for him to go to other manors at this time because he did not want to cause trouble for others at the juncture of investigating the Ministry of Revenue. No one dared to get too close to him. However, King Jing's manor was an exception. King Jing was the Empress Dowager's son, the youngest son, and the Emperor's younger brother. He had been silent and well-behaved for many years doing gardening. Everyone in the palace knew what his attitude meant, so they never really cared about him. Fan Jian and King Jing had always been on good terms. It was normal for him to go to his manor. Furthermore, given King Jing's personality, he was not afraid of anything. Then one day, Fan Jian entered the palace and had a deep and sincere conversation with the Emperor in the royal study. He very sincerely confessed his thoughts to the Emperor. He analyzed it from all aspects and felt that it was more suitable for him to continue to be the Minister of Revenue. On this issue he did not hide anything from the Emperor. Lingering was not a longing for battle. In such a seemingly peaceful but actually complicated situation, Fan Jian analyzed himself and the court stroke by stroke. He advised the Emperor that he should take back the order to investigate the Ministry of Revenue. Only then would it be the best choice for the Qing kingdom. This was an honorable path. Even the Emperor was a little surprised that he did not hide his own talents and was so honorable and upright. The next day it was said that King Jing also entered the palace. According to the rumors, this preposterous king muttered to himself for a long time in the Empress Dowager's Hongguang Palace. In the end he even argued with the Empress Dowager's ancestor. As for what they argued about, no one knew. That night, the Empress Dowager and the Emperor watched a play together. While eating melon seeds, the Empress Dowager told the Emperor about King Jing entering the palace. The Emperor smiled and didn't say anything. The Empress Dowager's meaning was clear. Her attitude was still the same as when Fan Xian had first entered Jingdo. The Fan family had done so much for the Li family, so they couldn't be treated too badly. Besides, it would not look good to have the youngest son enter the palace every day to make a fuss. Most importantly, this ancestor of the Empress Dowager knew that her grandsons were probably all looking bad in the Ministry of Revenue matter. If they investigated the Ministry of Revenue and found the royal family, where would the royal family put their face? Minister Fan had always thought that the emperor would always care about face more than the officials. He had not thought that the first person to feel embarrassed would be the Empress Dowager. However, the effect was about the same. The next day the edict came down. Although, in order to maintain the system of the court, it did not clearly take back the imperial edict to investigate the Ministry of Revenue. Using the excuse of state affairs, the emperor moved most of the officials in the joint investigation group back to their original ministries. Without question, the strength of the investigation of the Ministry of Revenue would be greatly weakened. The officials all let out a breath. The so-called good for you, good for me, good for everyone. It was just a smooth-sailing court. Why did it have to be so deadly? Everyone knew that the reason the palace's strength in investigating the Ministry of Revenue had weakened was certainly related to King Jing's ruckus in the palace. Thinking of this, the officials couldn't help but feel a strange feeling rise in their hearts. The Fan Manor and King Jing's manor had been on good terms for generations. This was something everyone knew. But things were different now. Starting from last autumn, it seemed that many problems had appeared between the two families. First, the battle between Fan Xian and the second prince had involved King Jing's heir, Li Hongqing. Later, the young lady of the Fan family had shocked the world by being taken as the last disciple of the Northern Qi imperial advisor, Ku He. The marriage between the two families had fallen through. But King Jing had entered the palace? Had the relationship between the two families been repaired? The civil and military officials sighed. They felt more and more that Fan Jian was unfathomable. At the same time, the emperor issued a rather elusive personnel appointment. Imperial Censor He Zongwei had been promoted to Imperial Censor of the Left and joined the team investigating the Ministry of Revenue. He Zongwei had once been a famous scholar in Jingdo who was as famous as Ho Jichang of Fan Xian's 4 disciples. Because he had always been on good terms with Guo Baoquan and had connections with the Ministry of Rites, he had delayed his steps into officialdom to avoid gossip. He waited until the spring examinations in the 5th year of the Qin calendar. Because of the death of a family member, he was forced to give up. As a result, this famous great scholar had never participated in the imperial examinations. In the hearts of the people, he was indeed an extremely unlucky person. On the other hand, He Zongwei's luck had been very good. Back then he had been on good terms with the Guo family and met the crown prince. His reputation had risen in the capital. Later, in the spring of the 5th year of the Qin calendar, he had coincidentally been involved in the matter of the previous prime minister's fall. In the end, he had caught the emperor's eye. Skipping over layers of procedures, he had been made an imperial censor of the imperial censor. In reality, everyone knew that this was because He Zongwei was good at swaying and choosing sides well. At one moment he stood on the crown prince's side, and at the next he stood on Xinyang's side. Now he had become the imperial censor of the left. For such a young figure to have reached such an official position, people couldn't help but be dumbfounded. Why did the emperor admire this person so much? It wasn't that such precedents had never existed before. For example, Sir Fan Jr. was younger than He Zongwei and had a higher official position. He had more power in his hands and his reputation was greater. The problem was, everyone knew that Sir Fan Jr. was a prince in the shadows. Furthermore, his reputation for both civil and martial arts was world famous. For him to have his current position was not surprising. But what was going on with He Zongwei? Some gossipy officials couldn't help but secretly laugh. Could it be that the emperor had found another illegitimate child? Regardless of how the officials and people guessed, in the end, this Jingdo talent who had been hidden in the second prince's carriage, in the eldest princess manor, and in the imperial censor's study had finally officially stepped onto the stage of history. Furthermore, he would shine endlessly in the years to come. Young, handsome, talented, in position, and with the emperor's appreciation, the imperial censor of the left, He Zongwei, was like a rising sun that dazzled people's eyes. Fan Xian, far away in Jiangnan, was probably a black hole that could swallow the sun. No one would believe that last year Fan Xian had used a black fist to beat this popular figure in court into a pig's head. This was He Zongwei's lifelong humiliation. He knew that Sir Fan Jr., far away in Jiangnan, looked down on him from the bottom of his heart. Now that the emperor thought highly of him, he had to do something for the emperor. The situation that had made the crown prince's head ache finally eased, but he still had to think of a way to wipe out the 400,000 liang of silver. Last night, the Empress Dowager had given her grandson a good scolding in Hongguang Palace before telling him that the emperor was not in a good mood. Grandmother could block it for him this time, but it did not mean she could block it for him in the future. The crown prince felt a bit of regret. In reality, these 2 years after Fan Xian entered the capital, he had been doing pretty well. He was honest, peaceful, and even played less with women. However, the him 2 years ago was indeed a bit preposterous. He had left so many loose ends that people could easily grab. Thinking of this, he began to remember the Minister of Revenue who had grabbed onto his tail tightly and made him feel incomparable pain. The Fan family. Compared to the second prince, who he had hated endlessly in the past, the crown prince was now certain that in the next few years, his greatest enemy was, without question, the Fan family, regardless of whether the old one or the young one. The investigation of the Ministry of Revenue had already brought the Eastern Palace and the Fan family into close combat. This time the Fan family had the upper hand. Regardless of whether or not the crown prince was willing to resolve this matter peacefully, given Fan Jian's intelligence, he knew that if the crown prince ascended to the throne, the Fan family would not have many good days. The crown prince was not the emperor. He had no feelings for the old woman far away in Danzhou. As for Fan Xian, because of the Yi family matter, this was an irreconcilable enmity. The crown prince could not hope that Fan Xian would stand on his side. He did not even hope that Fan Xian would not oppose him on the matter of inheriting the throne. Since the main conflict had been established, the other conflicts were secondary. All of the unhappiness of the past could be casually swept away. When his trusted aide sent him the second prince's invitation to meet on Lujing River, the crown prince thought for a moment and then agreed. He smiled coldly. He knew that his second brother also knew that if he wanted to defeat Fan Xian, relying on his own power was far from enough. There was only one chair. Regardless of whether it was the crown prince's or the second prince's, everyone could flash their daggers and snatch it again afterward. At the moment, they had to at least ensure that this chair would not fall under the third prince's butt. In the current situation, the emperor's two sons had to let go of their former enmity and unite. Only by uniting all the power that could be united could they defeat that abnormal bastard far away in Jiangnan. On Lujing River, the spring was as thick as a woman's eyes, gradually warming up. It was as if summer was coming. On a pleasure boat, the crown prince and the second prince drank and chatted merrily, admiring the scenery and the beauty. It was as if nothing untoward had happened between the two of them in all these years. Since the second prince had taken the initiative to extend his hand, he had to express his stance first. First, he expressed his apologies for Minister of Justice Yan Hongshu's dishonorable act of adding insult to injury during the investigation of the Ministry of Revenue. Of course, he would not say it clearly. Although the crown prince could sometimes be a bit of an idiot, most of the time he could still be considered a smart person. The crown prince also sighed and said that after Fan Xian entered the capital, he had suppressed him less. The two brothers met each other's eyes and saw the faint worry and a glimmer of helplessness in each other's hearts. The power in Fan Xian's hands was too great. Furthermore, the old men standing behind him were too powerful. More importantly, it seemed that there were some people in the palace who were leaning toward his side. Li Qingping and the third prince had always been by Fan Xian's side. What exactly did father mean by this arrangement? The crown prince and the second prince sank into silence at the same time. In the end, it was the second prince who slowly opened his mouth and said with a light laugh, "Your Highness, I heard that Fan Xian has opened a branch of Baoyue brothel in Suzhou. There are two girls inside who are very famous. One is a girl he stole from Hongqing's hands. The other is rather interesting. I heard she is a female slave in brother's manner." The crown prince lowered his eyes and gritted his teeth. With a cold huff he said, "That big brother of ours, that day in the royal study, didn't he also speak up for Fan Xian? It looks like he is truly afraid of that great princess from northern Qi. Second brother, you and big brother are always close. How come you can't see that he is a fool?" The second prince raised his eyebrows and smiled. He chuckled and didn't continue to say anything. At this time, a warm breeze was blowing gently on the river. The pleasure boat swam slowly. The willow branches by the shore could not stand the gradually hot weather and hoped that the rain that had stopped in the morning would fall again. The expressions of the two people by the window were gentle. In reality, they each had their own ulterior motives. However, they had no choice but to sit together and discuss matters. He Zhongwei will continue to investigate the Ministry of Revenue, the second prince said with a slight smile. Don't worry, he knows his limits. The crown prince huffed coldly. Including the Ministry of Rights and He Zhongwei, these people were actually originally close to the Eastern Palace. Later they were all pulled over by the eldest princess and the second prince. Now He Zhongwei had already established himself in court. How could the crown prince not hate him? He coldly said, "Don't forget, He Zhongwei is passionate about fame and is a true slave of 3 families. Today he stands on your side. Who knows how he will stand in the future?" The second prince looked at the deep spring scenery outside the boat in a daze and sighed. "Don't worry, he won't throw his lot in with Fan Xian." The crown prince said, "But, given his present position, it seems that there is no need for him to continue staying under your tutelage." He mockingly said, "When all is said and done, this position was given to him by father." The second prince was slightly startled. He knew that the crown prince's words had meaning, but he couldn't be bothered to refute it. He smiled slightly and said, "It is not convenient for him to come today precisely because of the reason you mentioned. Since he is already a court official, of course he has to pay attention to keeping his distance from us." However, the second prince turned to look at the crown prince. His face still held a harmless and gentle smile, but a glimmer of disgust grew in his heart. He also felt a bit uncomfortable that this person, whom he had always looked down on, was now forced to work together with him. "I have asked you to come today because someone wants to see you." The crown prince furrowed his brows and said, "Who is so arrogant as to dare call me to see him? Am I not allowed to?" A gentle, clear and seductive female voice came from the back of the room. The moment this voice came out, it seemed to immediately drown out the beautiful sounds of the wind blowing through the willows and the light flight of birds. It was incomparably moving. The crown prince's expression changed. A complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. He was dumbstruck. A moment later he slowly stood up and bowed toward the back of the room. He said self-mockingly, "After Aunt entered the palace, I have not seen Qingqian. Qingqian thought Aunt was not happy to see me." The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, lifted the beaded curtain and slowly walked out. She gazed at the crown prince with a faint smile. The crown prince involuntarily felt a wave of nervousness. He didn't dare to look directly at that beautiful, otherworldly face. This time, it seems that we have all fallen for the Ministry of Revenue matter. Exhaustion appeared on the eldest princess' face, but it could not hide her brilliance. Suddenly she burst into laughter and said, "This son-in-law of mine is truly interesting. He set up a trap for us to fall into." Fortunately, King Jing made a ruckus. Otherwise, if the matter got out of hand and we couldn't find evidence of the Ministry of Revenue stealing national funds to Jiangnan, it would be difficult to explain to the civil and military officials in court. The Ministry of Revenue's silver had made a round in Jiangnan and had long returned. Naturally, they couldn't find anything. Although some silver was still in the Jiangnan money house, the amount was not large. Given Fan Jian's ruthlessness, it was naturally covered up without any loopholes. The crown prince looked at his nose and quietly said, "Aunt, please give me some pointers." "I just came to drink tea today," the eldest princess said with a slight smile. "After all, you are blood brothers. Everything can be laid out and discussed. Don't let outsiders laugh at you." When she said the words blood brothers, she put emphasis on the word blood, and bit the tip of her tongue to emphasize her tone. Although it was a point, it revealed a glimmer of temptation. The crown prince said in a trembling voice, "But if the Ministry of Revenue can't find anything to use against Fan Xian, this person, there are no loopholes to grab. We can only wait for him to cultivate his wings in Jiangnan. What if he returns to the capital in the future? Naturally, the Ministry of Revenue will be investigated." The eldest princess's watery eyes stared at the crown prince's face. She smiled and said, "Brother Emperor has temporarily taken a step back. In the future he will definitely take a big step forward. You don't have to worry about this. As for my son-in-law, you don't have to worry even more. And Ji, this person looks like he won't budge. In reality, it is very easy to deal with him." The crown prince and second prince were both stunned, wondering where these words came from. For a person like Fan Xian, it was not easy to ruin him, and it was even harder to bring him down. It was impossible to destroy him spiritually, and it was even more difficult to destroy him physically. Why did the eldest princess say it so lightly? My son-in-law, the eldest princess said gently, looks heartless, but in reality, he is heartless but full of affection. After the secret conference on Lujing River ended, the second prince boarded the carriage under the protection of the 8 generals and returned directly to his manor in the north of Jingdo. Presently, one of the 8 generals had been killed by Fan Xian, and Fan Wuxia had been scared back to his home by the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau. There were only 6 people left. They had long lost their former prestige. The second prince had been a king for many years and had been married for many months. His relationship with Wang Fei had always been very good. There had not been any bad rumors. Wang Fei's surname was Yi and her name was Ling Er. In the bedroom, Yi Ling Er draped a thin sky-blue robe over her husband. A faint worry floated on her usually cheerful face. The second prince turned around and glanced. His heart was slightly apologetic. Holding her slightly cold hands, he comfortingly said, "What are you thinking about?" "Today." Yi Ling Er bit her lower lip. A glimmer of struggle flashed through her bright jade-like eyes. Finally, she gathered her courage and said, "Where did you go?" The second prince lowered his head and was silent for a moment. He then replied straightforwardly, "I went to Lujing River to see my aunt and the crown prince." A warmth welled up in Yi Ling Er's heart. It seemed that since the second prince did not hide such an important matter from her, it meant that he was truly treating her as someone close to him. She couldn't resist persuading, "Why? Isn't it better for us to live peacefully?" After being married for many months, the second prince was gentle and considerate. He did not show the domineering and shameless side of the royal family. This was partly because Yi Ling Er's background was also very deep. It was also because he had some affection for Yi Ling Er. The younger generation of the Qing kingdom had actually all grown up together, such as Wan Er, the princes, Yi Ling Er, and the young lady of the Fan family. The division between the royal family and the trusted families was not clear. The second prince knew that his wife was thinking for him. He couldn't resist sighing and said, "There are many things that we have no choice in." Yi Ling Er stared at him in a daze and suddenly said, "In the past it was the emperor who pushed you out, but now, teacher, Fan Xian has already taken over your role. Why do you still want to participate?" The second prince sighed again. After a moment of silence, he said, "If it is really as you say, my historical mission has already been completed. I should indeed not participate in these matters, but don't forget," he said with slight mockery, "the teacher you speak of, the most famous Sir Fan Jr. in the Qing court, is actually someone who holds a grudge the most." Yi Ling Er furrowed her brows slightly and said unhappily, "What grudge can't be resolved? Do you want me to go talk to him?" Although the second prince secretly laughed at his wife's childishness, he was also faintly moved. Pulling her into his arms, he comfortingly said, "There are many grudges between men that can't be resolved through friendship in the boudoir." He didn't explain in detail, but he knew that the grudge between him and Fan Xian would be difficult to resolve. The guards who died on Yolan Street, the Baoyue brothel incident, the dead prostitutes and many more, Fan Xian had placed all the blame on him. This was actually also something the second prince did not understand. It was clear that only some unimportant subordinates had died, so why did Fan Xian hate him so much? In order to protect himself, he had to have power. Of course, the most important reason was that the second prince was still not satisfied even now. Everyone was not satisfied, but few people knew of Fan Xian's good intentions far away in Jiangnan. I've even read the reviews of the book. Thank you. I just don't have time to add to it. I'm really sorry. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 393. The Crown Prince had been scolded, the scope of the investigation had shrunk, and the Ministry of Revenue was temporarily safe. The Overwatch Council could straighten its back again. This matter was very interesting. Whether or not the first bureau of the Overwatch Council could straighten their backs depended on the angle of the Minister of Revenue's body and the ground. The scholar slammed the table in the Hall of Governmental Affairs and pointed at the faces of the elders of the 6 departments, cursing these officials for their uncleanliness. In any case, he was still young and hot-tempered. He did not need to be like Xu Wu and always put on the bearing and demeanor of a senior official. What the emperor needed was the scholar's reputation and drive. However, in the matter of investigating the Ministry of Revenue, the scholar had not completely satisfied the emperor's requirements. In his opinion, at least from the situation of the investigation, the Ministry of Revenue was truly not easy. What made Hu the scholar most angry was that even now, some officials in court still could not forget and wanted to find evidence of crimes related to Jiangnan in the Ministry of Revenue's accounts. The sound of slamming the table rang out again. Hu the scholar furrowed his brows deeply and stared coldly at the official beside him. In a low voice he said, "Moving silver to Jiangnan? Where is the silver? Isn't it still in the Ministry of Revenue's treasury? In the future, if you don't have evidence, don't talk about these groundless things to avoid chilling the officials' hearts." He looked at the ashen-faced officials and snorted coldly, "Sirs, take care of yourselves." After saying this, Hu the scholar shook out his sleeves and walked out of the little room beside the royal palace, leaving behind many officials in the room looking at each other. Everyone felt deep regret and embarrassment. When investigating the Ministry of Revenue, the Ministry of Revenue was clean. On the contrary, it was their faction that had countless problems found. The backers behind these officials were all inextricably linked to Jiangnan. From the situation in Jiangnan, these major figures determined that the silver fan Xian used to clash with the Ming family had certainly been moved out of the national treasury. It was because of this judgment that these people dared to attack the Ministry of Revenue so confidently. Since so much silver was still stored in the Palace Treasury Transport Company, then the national treasury would certainly not be able to erase it. Yet there was not a trace of it. These officials gnashed their teeth in hatred. Even after being reprimanded by Hu the scholar, they did not dare to talk back. Hu told them to shout so loudly and yet not be able to find any problems. The father and son of the Fan family were too treacherous. It was early in the morning, and the sun in the east had not yet risen. The Hall of Governmental Affairs was only drafting the memorials for the court conference. The expressions of the officials were all a bit tired. Most of them had not slept all night. However, thinking of the fight in the court conference, everyone had to raise their spirits. The first stage of the Ministry of Revenue's investigation had clearly ended with the complete defeat of the eldest princess and the Eastern Palace. But how could they salvage the situation? Intentionally or unintentionally, these officials cast their gazes towards a young official who had been sitting in a dark corner. This young official's name was Wei. He was one of the most popular people in the court. He had some previous connections with the eldest princess's Eastern Palace and was now deeply appreciated by the emperor. It was precisely because Hu the scholar did not want to make a big fuss about the Ministry of Revenue that the emperor had many intentions that could not be expressed verbally and could not be smoothly handled through the officials. This was why the imperial censorate's new imperial censor of the left, Wei, was transferred to the team investigating the Ministry of Revenue. The officials looked at Wei. Naturally, they wanted to know from this young official's mouth exactly how the palace was going to handle this matter. He had been specially ordered to listen in on matters in the Hall of Governmental Affairs for 3 days. He had been steady and proper. He was respectful and strict toward Hu the scholar and the other officials. He did not say much and did not act rashly. He was deeply steady. However, being stared at by these officials, Wei knew that he had to show some ability. This was not only for himself but also for the emperor. "What a mess," he sighed and warmly said to the officials. "It looks like this matter will have to be slowly tormented. Hu the scholar was a bit anxious earlier. Please do not worry too much." Slowly dealing with it showed the palace's attitude. The Fan Manor's response was clever and unyielding. It made it so that the palace could not find a good way to replace the Minister of Revenue in a short time. They could only wait for another opportunity. The officials fell silent. They were dissatisfied and also faintly worried. Since Fan Jian's position did not change, the officials who had led the attack would have to pay a corresponding price. In the court conference after the matter, the officials belonging to the eldest princess and the Eastern Palace launched a final attack. It was not to kill the enemy but to protect themselves. Even though the Ministry of Revenue was clean, the investigation team still found some problems. Under the guidance of Wei, who had joined after the matter, the officials gave up on the shocking crimes and only focused on the small problems in the Ministry of Revenue. For example, some accounts were unclear, or a small sum of silver had disappeared. Although they were all small problems, they at least showed that they were investigating the Ministry of Revenue not to hold a grudge or take revenge. They truly wanted to find the problems in the Ministry of Revenue. In the court conference, listening to the impassioned accusations of the officials, Hu the scholar smiled coldly in the first position on the left. Shu Wu stood beside him with a face full of worry. The Minister of Appointments, Yan Hangshu, did not say a word. The emperor sat upright on the dragon chair and looked at a person among the civil officials with a complicated gaze. The Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, had also come to the court conference. The emperor looked at Fan Jian's slightly grizzled hair and sighed in his heart. He opened his mouth and asked, "Where did that 180,000 liang of silver go?" Fan Jian stepped out of the ranks. He did not defend himself or explain. Showing his old age, he bowed and directly asked for forgiveness. The 180,000 liang of silver had long been sent to the river transport governor's yamen. The court immediately burst into an uproar. The Ministry of Appointments and related officials who had strongly advocated investigating the Ministry of Revenue had a flash of joy on their faces. They had no idea why the experienced and ruthless Minister of Revenue would admit in court, in front of the emperor, that he had secretly moved silver from the national treasury to the river transport governor's yamen. They knew this was an opportunity that could not be missed. In an instant, the officials all stepped out and righteously criticized the Ministry of Revenue. They aimed the spearhead at Fan Jian. In this world, only the emperor's edict had the power to move silver from the national treasury. No one else could do so. Fan Jian had the Ministry of Revenue move silver into the river transport governor's yamen without the royal approval. No matter how one looked at it, it was a crime of deceiving the emperor. The emperor stared at Fan Jian's tired face. A faint light flashed through his eyes. It seemed that he did not hear the voices of the officials in court asking for the Ministry of Revenue to be punished. The emperor did not hear it, but some officials heard it clearly. Hearing it, anger filled the depths of their hearts. The deficit in the Ministry of Revenue was closely connected to the officials who attacked the Ministry of Revenue. Even if Minister Fan's move of silver from the national treasury to the river works was not appropriate, his intentions were understandable. This was for the court and the people, yet it became a sore spot for those shameless people to attack. Shu Wu's brows trembled anxiously. The anger in his eyes flared. He turned his head and glared at the civil officials who had stepped out. In reality, these elders of the Hall of Governmental Affairs all knew that if the court wanted to move silver, the procedures were very complicated. If they really had to slowly ask for an edict to move silver into the river works, the river would probably have long been short of banks. In the depths of winter, Shu Wu had once complained to the emperor about this matter. Although he did not know the details of Fan Jian moving silver from the Ministry of Revenue into the river transport governor's yamen, he dared to conclude that this had nothing to do with personal gain. Bullshit. Moving silver to repair the river? The Fan family had no land on either side of the river. What benefit could they possibly get? Shu Wu forcefully suppressed the anger in his chest and stood out. He bowed to the emperor on the dragon chair. Seeing this virtuous and respected scholar step out of the ranks, the officials attacking the Ministry of Revenue all stopped speaking and returned to their ranks. The emperor glanced at him and said, "What is the crime of secretly moving silver from the national treasury?" Old Shu the scholar raised his head and straightforwardly said, "Your Majesty, if you want to ask about the Qing law, you should ask the Ministry of Justice and Supreme Court. I work in the Hall of Governmental Affairs, but I am not very familiar with the Qing law." The emperor gave a not quite there smile and said, "What does the scholar want to say?" Shu Wu bowed again and turned around to glance disdainfully at the petty officials in the court. Only then did he slowly say, "I think that Minister Fan is not at fault in this matter." "How so?" "The matter of the river works has always been tight. This year, fortunately, the spring floods are not as strong as in previous years, but the summer floods are about to arrive. As for the matter of the Ministry of Revenue moving silver into the river works yamen." Shu Wu took a deep breath and respectfully said, "It was I who wrote the memorial in the Hall of Governmental Affairs and directly sent it to the Ministry of Revenue. Thus, I actually know about the matter of the Ministry of Revenue moving silver." After these words were said, the court burst into another uproar. Shu the scholar was willing to take a great risk and tie himself to the Fan family? Why was he doing this? Minister Fan also seemed to be surprised as he looked at the old scholar in front of him. The emperor furrowed his brows slightly. A moment later, he suddenly smiled and said, "Oh? Why didn't I know about this matter? I am muddle-headed. Please forgive me, Your Majesty." Shu the scholar was not muddle-headed. Earlier, the discussion in the court was ferocious and he could not stand it. The sliver of old but firm conscience at the bottom of his heart surged. His blood rushed and made him stand out to be a guarantor for the Ministry of Revenue. Now that he had come to his senses, he knew the emperor would certainly not like someone in his Hall of Governmental Affairs to be a guarantor for the 6 ministries. He forced a smile and lowered his voice. "Your Majesty, take pity on my old age. Yesterday I drank a few cups too much and spoke with youthful frivolity. At this time, even if I wanted to shut my mouth, I can't." The emperor saw a dignified scholar playing the role of a clown and couldn't resist laughing. The sliver of unhappiness from being contradicted gradually dissipated. He couldn't strip the Minister of Revenue and a scholar of their positions for a mere 180,000 liang of silver. Hu Shuji, the emperor asked with a slight smile. In your opinion, what crime should the Ministry of Revenue be charged with? Scholar Hu stepped out. After a moment of consideration, he quietly said, the crime of deceiving the emperor. There was a buzz in the court. The emperor raised his brows and asked with interest, then how should they be punished? Not. Hu the scholar lowered his body very low. What? The Ministry of Revenue moving silver into the river works is out of the public good and out of loyalty to serve your majesty. Although it is deceiving the emperor, it is a deceiving of love for the emperor, Hu the scholar said lightly. Hu the scholar faintly said, when the Qing law convicts people, they care about understanding reason and setting the situation. A clear heart knows the reason and understands the situation. The officials of the Ministry of Revenue and the minister are magnanimous and sincere. Your Majesty, please investigate. The emperor seemed to be very interested in this saying. He smiled slightly and said, but the law is here. If we don't act according to the law, how can we pacify the mouths of the people under heaven? How can we pacify the desire of the officials to abide by the law? There is no need to block the mouths of the people under heaven, Hu the scholar replied in an even voice. As long as the breach in the dikes of the great rivers can be blocked, the people can see with their eyes, hear with their ears, have food to eat and have a place to live, they will know of your Majesty's painstaking efforts. The emperor was moved and nodded his head. Hu the scholar continued, as for the officials. A faint, bitter smile suddenly rose to the corners of his lips. If the officials truly abide by the law, then so be it. In my opinion, although the Qing law is important, it is not as important as a word from the emperor. If your Majesty sympathizes with the hard work of the Ministry of Revenue and deals with them leniently, the officials in court will be grateful. In the end, he quietly said, Your Majesty, it has been raining continuously recently. This last sentence was said very quietly. Other than a few officials near the throne, no one else could hear it. The emperor sank into deep thought. He knew that the scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs closest to him were standing on the side of the Fan family for the sake of the court and the wealth of the Qing kingdom. He furrowed his brows and thought that Hu and Shu did not know his true intentions. They had also been provoked by the matter of Xiuhe, which was why they had come out to protect the Fan family. But was his method this time truly inappropriate? Did all the officials in court with some conscience think Fan Jian should stay? His furrowed brows gradually relaxed. Gazing at Fan Jian below, he quietly asked, I don't want to hear what other people say. Tell me, why did you move the silver to the river transport governor's yamen without my permission? Fan Jian sighed and took a few steps forward. Bowing to the ground, he replied simply, Your Majesty, I'm afraid I won't make it in time. This amount of silver was actually a portion of the silver the Ministry of Revenue had sent to Jiangnan. The emperor knew this and so did Fan Jian. The emperor knew this. In court, he had been attacked by the officials using this as an opportunity, yet Fan Jian insisted on not defending himself. He did not try to have the emperor share the burden for him. For the benefit of the people, he dared to move the silver from the treasury to Xiuhe River. He was truly a rare righteous official in the Qing kingdom. No wonder he had moved the scholars Hu and Shu. For the emperor's face, he dared to not defend himself in the face of a serious crime. He was truly a rare loyal servant in the Qing kingdom. No wonder the emperor was moved. The emperor thought deeply and then slowly nodded his head. After the court meeting, a clear edict came down. The Ministry of Revenue was in a serious deficit. The emperor was furious and ordered the investigation to continue. The problems that had already been found were handed over to the Overwatch Council and Supreme Court to be responsible for investigating. The Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, was stripped of his second-rank title, fined his salary and kept in office. Speaking of which, it was funny. This second-rank title had been added by the palace after Fan Xian had saved the emperor in the Hanging Temple. As for the salary forfeiture, adding on to the salary forfeiture last time, Fan Jian would not receive a salary for a full 2 years. However, he still sat firmly in the position of Minister of Revenue. Correspondingly, the deficit that the Ministry of Revenue had found implicated many officials. A vigorous investigation began. The various powers were forced to cut off their own hands and feet to prevent the deficit the Ministry of Revenue had suppressed for so many years from cutting off their own heads. The crown prince's 400,000 liang of silver had been filled by the Empress Dowager's private savings. However, the officials of the other factions did not have such a good grandmother. Regardless of whether it was the Eastern Palace faction or the eldest princess faction, large numbers of officials fell one by one. Some new blood, such as He Zhongwei, began to gradually enter the court. Last autumn, because of Fan Xian's battle with the second prince, a group of officials had already been purged. This late spring, because of the battle between the Ministry of Revenue and the eldest princess, another group of officials had been purged. Abandonment became the main style in the court for a time. The origin of this story was in Jiangnan. It was because Fan Xian had created this fake situation that the people on the eldest princess's side thought they had caught the Fan family's greatest crime. That was why they dared to throw out so many pawns into this muddy water with the intention of pulling the Jingdo Fan family off their horse. However, no one had thought that the silver had come from northern Qi. The Fan family did not touch the silver in the national treasury. Of course, the emperor thought he knew that the Fan family had moved with his permission. The emperor thought he knew everything under heaven, but he was wrong. In any case, the Fan family had found a foothold with unusual difficulty, and the emperor's control over the officials increased a bit, making the palace a bit more stable. Everyone was happy. Looking at the present situation, at least on the surface, there was no longer any power in Jingdo that could threaten that chair. For a moment, spring was bright and peaceful. Secretly, the crown prince and the second prince were forced to form a temporary alliance. Although the Fan family had suffered some damage because of this matter, everyone knew that if Fan Xian, who was far away in Jiangnan, came back, something big was sure to happen. To be able to force two irreconcilable dragons to unite together, this kind of might and power was enough to make everyone feel proud and elated. However, Fan Xian, who had caused all of this to happen, did not feel the slightest bit proud. For one, it was because news from Jingdo had no way to travel so quickly to the distant Jiangnan. For another, it was because he could beat the princes until they didn't dare to make a sound in Jingdo. However, in Jiangnan, far away from Jingdo, faced with the Ming family that kept retreating, he suddenly found that it was strangely difficult to defeat the Ming family. It was even more difficult than defeating his royal brothers. Happy weekend. Those who have a monthly ticket, vote for one. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 394. The battles in politics and business often had a common point. Every time it looked like they were at the end of the line, it was as if there was a glimmer of hope at the end of the tunnel. Just as the oil was cooking the fire, who knew that it would instantly turn into a cold autumn? Xinyang and the Eastern Palace thought they had a clear grasp of the Ministry of Revenue's battle in Jingdo and had grasped the Fan family's biggest weakness. They arrogantly and eerily took action, wanting to have the Fan family's circumference insignia change owners. Who would have thought that in the end, it would be the complete opposite and they would lose a large amount of power for no reason? Going back to Jiangnan, Fan Xian held the imperial envoy Ming Jian in his hand, cleared out the palace treasury, took control of the transport company, and through Xia Qifei forced the Ming family's money to tighten. Then, through that lawsuit, he successfully plunged the Ming family into chaos. Then, through the enormous Overwatch Council's help, he made things difficult for the Ming family everywhere under heaven. His manner was overbearing, as if he could crush the Ming family into a pile of powder at any moment. At such a moment, who would have thought that so many shocking things would happen? My people want to enter the garden. Fan Xian slapped the table. His eyes were like hooks as he looked coldly at the person in front of him. Enunciating each word, he said, "Sir Shui, I have already waited 10 days. I will not wait any longer today." The person sitting beside him was the most powerful person in Jiangnan, Governor Xueqing of Jiangnan Road. The place the two of them were having their secret discussion was in the study of the governor's manor. The accounts master of the Juanshan conference, who was also the Ming family's housekeeper, Zhou, had already been discovered by the Overwatch Council and was currently hiding in the Ming garden. Regardless of whether it was for the assassination attempt at Jiangnan restaurant or Fan Xian's strong interest in the Juanshan conference, the Overwatch Council had enough reason to kill their way into the Ming garden and drag out that person. However, it was, after all, the Ming garden, one of the 3 great gardens in the world. It represented the interests of countless people in Jiangnan, countless people's lives and countless people's hopes. Even if Fan Xian wanted to send people into the Ming garden to search, he had no choice. He had to first go to the Jiangnan governor's manor to communicate with Xueqing. As long as Xue Qing was willing to nod, Fan Xian did not care much about the Ming family or the Jiangnan aristocracy. It was a pity that time was pressing, so he could not send a bow to Wuzhou first. Naturally, he would not be able to clearly find out what Xue Qing's bottom line was from his father-in-law's mouth. Fan Xian could only go straight to the governor's manor and make this seemingly shocking suggestion. Xue Qing's attitude was clear. Xue Qing's attitude. Yes. Wanted the governor's manor to send people to the investigation? No way. The Jiangnan governor was not afraid of offending the Ming family, but he knew how ruthless it was. The Ming garden was like a door. In the first few months, he and Fan Xian had been tidying up the Ming family's property outside the door and tormenting the Ming family's spirit. They had not touched the Ming family's foundation. Thus, the other party had blindly retreated, endured, and appeared weak. Once the people of the government stepped into the Ming family's high threshold, the proper court of the Qing kingdom did not care about overthrowing a wealthy merchant family, even if this family was the wealthiest in the Qing kingdom. The problem was, the Ming family directly and indirectly supported hundreds of thousands of people and affected the lives of most of the common people in Jiangnan. The Ming family did not even need to fight back. As long as this situation came out, the stability of all of Jiangnan would become a major problem. Governor Xue Qing looked coldly at the young man beside him. He thought to himself, "You are the imperial envoy. When the time comes and Jiangnan becomes a mess, you can just pat your butt and leave. After you return to the capital, there is still the Emperor, Director Qin and Minister Fan to support you. But what about me? Will I have to throw all the mess after this onto myself? If Jiangnan is not stable, how can I continue as governor?" Thus, after Fan Xian politely came to the governor's manor to discuss matters, Xue Qing firmly refused the request of both sides to cooperate in investigating the case. His words were very clear. Since it was that mysterious Juanshan conference, since it was a problem the Overwatch Council had found from the beginning, and since it did not involve local government, it was fine for his people to help the Overwatch Council clean up on the outside. However, he was not willing to directly enter Ming Garden and cause trouble. This was the way of being an official. Xue Qing knew that Fan Xian was not certain of the trouble that could arise from searching Ming Garden, which was why he was dragging him down with him. How could he just obediently go down? It had already been delayed for 10 days and Xue Qing was still not willing to relent. Fan Xian's heart began to gradually become angry. After leaving the governor's yamen, Fan Xian climbed into the carriage. He furrowed his brows and supported his chin with his hand. He began to stare blankly. Deng Ziyu glanced at Fan Xian and quietly said, "We have people watching the Ming Garden the entire time. I heard that the fourth Ming master hasn't suffered much in the Suzhou government. If we want to enter Ming Garden to capture people, we can do it ourselves. Actually, we don't necessarily need the governor's manor's help. I'm just afraid we will lose some people." Naturally, Ming Garden had its own thugs and even powerful private military forces. Fan Xian had once glanced at the garden from a distance and knew that with some slight modifications, the garden could become a sturdy castle. If the Overwatch Council wanted to forcefully attack it without the help of the Black Knights, it would be a difficult matter. If Xue Qing did not nod, the Black Knights would not be able to enter deep into the bustling city of Jiangnan. Entering the garden is not difficult. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. As long as the Ming family is not prepared to rebel, the Overwatch Council can take my personal letter and enter the garden to search. Would they dare to stop us? What castle and military forces? It's all fake. The old Ming matriarch wouldn't dare to move a single person. His face gradually became cold. But, if we want to enter Ming Garden to capture people, there are two problems. First, we don't know how many aces there are in the Juanshan conference. If that housekeeper Zhou, who knows the inside story of the Juanshan conference, has not been silenced, will those aces protect him from Suzhou? Second, we can't make too much of a ruckus. The Ming family has already shown weakness for a few months. The atmosphere of sorrow is incomparably thick, particularly after the fourth Ming master was captured and brought into the Suzhou government. The Suzhou government has not been released, and the rumors outside are becoming more and more bizarre. Deng Ziyu listened quietly to the side. He knew what the commissioner was worried about. Presently, all of Jiangnan was saying that the Overwatch Council, under Fan Xian's command, was bullying the Ming family with the intention of taking over their property. It was about to evolve into a story of murder and theft. One had to have a good reason for going against the Ming family. However, the court's reason for dealing with the Ming family had never been straightened out. Thus, in Jiangnan, from the gentry to the common people, They all began to stare at Fan Xian with wary and disgusted gazes. The reputation Fan Xian had built in Jingdo for 2 years had already been greatly polluted. Ming Qingda is a smart person, Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said. This move of retreating in order to advance is indeed beautiful. It looks like they are only retreating, but we are still pressing forward step by step. In the eyes of the common people, their emotions will always be biased. Furthermore, the Ming family has deep roots in Jiangnan. Their ability to mobilize public opinion is much stronger than our own 8th Bureau. Ever since they knew that housekeeper Zhou was hiding in Ming Garden, the Overwatch Council Palace Treasury Transport Company's attacks on the Ming family became more and more ferocious. The Ming family's property was endlessly harassed and gradually looked like the sun was setting in the west. It looked incomparably pitiful. Public opinion is a very important matter. Reputation is also very important, Fan Xian sighed. If we continue to suppress the Ming family like this, not only will the common people be disgusted with me, even the royal merchants that Xia Qifei is in contact with will probably grow wary of the court. No one knows whether or not they will become the second Ming family. What gives me the biggest headache is... He shook his head. Right now, we are not clear about the situation in the capital. I don't know if we make too big of a move, too many people will die and too much criticism will be stirred up. Will it give the people in the capital an excuse to move me back? With the situation in Jiangnan still unsettled, Fan Xian did not want to return to the capital, particularly since he would be held back by the women in the palace. It was not a situation he could accept. When the carriage arrived at Hua Garden, he said a few words to the third prince and the others. Then he brought Deng Ziyu and a few trusted aides into the study. He spread out a map on the large desk and began to think deeply. Fan Xian thought for a while and then used his finger to point at a certain city on the map. In a quiet voice he asked, "Has the news from Quanzhou come back?" The home of the concubine of the direct heir of the Ming family, Ming Lansher, was in a village next to Quanzhou. The Overwatch Council had already investigated that the brother of the concubine had been on the East Sea the entire time. He was responsible for the Ming family's pirate business and robbing their own merchant ships. The head of the pirates had already been silenced by the military people the Ming family had colluded with. The concubine had also disappeared. In the words of the Ming family, she had gone home to visit relatives. Of course, the Overwatch Council knew this was a lie. But who could expose this lie? That concubine did not return to the village, a member of the Qinian unit reported. A member of the Qinian unit reported, "We didn't find any traces of bandits along the way. They were probably killed in Suzhou." Fan Xian nodded. This was something he had long expected, so he was not surprised. Straightforwardly he asked, "What is important is that since that village was the pirate's home, there must have been people who followed him onto the island to become bandits. Those relatives must have some understanding of this matter. Since the Ming family had bathed that island in blood, those villagers would not foolishly stand on the side of the Ming family." A glimmer of shame flashed across the face of the member of the Qinian unit. "That village is already empty." Fan Xian furrowed his brows tightly. The village was empty? There was no need to ask for a reason. Since it was empty, it could not be separated from those dirty tricks. What about the families here? His finger was still pointing directly at Quanzhou. Furrowing his brows he asked, "The officials of the shipping department were killed by those pirates. When did those families come to the Suzhou government to report?" Another member of the Qinian unit replied in a heavy voice, "Most of those families have already returned to the mainland. Only a few are still in Quanzhou. However, the people of the 4th Bureau went to ask probingly. Those families received a large sum of compensation. Their desire to pursue the pirates has faded. What is important is, the Ming family has indeed treated them well. They do not believe the Ming family would collude with the pirates." Fan Xian was startled. Shortly after, he said with slight mockery, "Of course not collusion. The Ming family is the pirates." Immediately after, he asked a few more about the previous arrangements of the 4th Bureau and received not very good answers. Only now did he know that after he cut down the Cui family in Jingdo and during the days when Yan Bingyun was plotting against the Ming family had already made sufficient preparations. They did not leave behind too many loopholes. Fan Xian sat down on the slightly cold chair. In his hands, he held a bowl of warm tea as his thoughts wandered. His subordinate looked at the commissioner in silence, not knowing what to say. It looked like it would be difficult to bring down the Ming family in a short amount of time if he took the open and above-board path. However, he had to use the Overwatch Council's dirty methods. After all, Jiangnan was not other places. He had to worry about the reaction of the people. If it really caused the entire population to take to the streets for a walk, it would be difficult for the Overwatch Council to clean up. Thinking of this, Fan Xian began to feel angry at Xue Qing's indecisiveness. If the Jiangnan governor appeared and he followed from behind, one in the light and one in the dark, one red face and one white face, perhaps this matter would be much simpler. However, Fan Xian did not feel too defeated. He knew that in the battle between the court and the Ming family could forever only stand on the passive defensive side. Fan Xian had plenty of time to slowly play with the Ming family. The reason he was in a hurry to enter Ming Garden was because he wanted to clearly investigate the role of the Juanshan Conference. In the battle with the Ming family, he could endlessly try to bring them down. Even if he did not succeed once, he could try again after resting for a while. But the Ming family could not. This large family could not be defeated even once. Once they were defeated, they would be wiped out. Get ready. Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly and said, "Get ready to enter the garden to capture people at any time." Deng Ziyu hesitated for a moment and then said, "Not waiting for Governor Xue to make his stance clear?" Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "When I do things, I never like to follow in other people's footsteps. I've waited for 10 days and given Xue Qing enough face. If I act now, he can't blame me for being ruthless." "What about the Jiangnan people's discussion?" "Discussion? They say I'm bullying the Ming family? I'll go in gently and gently. I won't hit a single person and won't kill a single person. How am I bullying them?" A glimmer of a smile appeared on Fan Xian's face. "Besides, I've thought it through. Something like reputation, once it's ruined in Jiangnan, I'll slowly pick it back up in the future." Fan Xian waited for 10 days not because he did not have the confidence to enter Ming Garden and capture housekeeper Zhou. It was not purely because he had misgivings about discussion or because he wanted to wait for Xue Qing to make his stance clear. More importantly, he was waiting for news from Jingdo. After the palace treasury bidding, he knew clearly that the eldest princess faction in Jingdo would launch an attack on the Ministry of Revenue. He was waiting for the result of this matter. The matter was in Jiangnan, but the commander was in Jingdo. As long as the situation in Jingdo was unclear, it would be difficult for Fan Xian to act in Jiangnan. The next day, birds cried out from the willow branches. 3 fast horses charged into Suzhou under the cover of dawn. The bailiffs guarding the city only knew that the people coming were secret agents of the Overwatch Council and did not dare to stop them. The sound of hooves thundered as they charged outside Suzhou's Hua Garden. Someone had long led the 3 riders into the garden. This was the Overwatch Council's fastest way to send news. It was many times faster than the Qing Court's courier service. Fan Xian held the council report Mu Tai had sent from the capital and was slightly happy. He knew that the result of the matter was as he had guessed. The Ministry of Revenue was fine, and the eldest princess side had suffered a great loss. However, as intelligent as he was, he could clearly see that the emperor wanted to use the opportunity to have the old Fan family in Jingdo leave the stage. His slightly happy face immediately darkened. However, he didn't have time to think about his father's matter. Fan Xian shook his head and said to the Overwatch Council official beside him who had been receiving orders the entire time, "Enter Ming Garden and arrest them." The Overwatch Council official accepted the order and left. For a moment, a number of officials came out from the yamen all around Suzhou. The hooves of horses shattered the silence of the morning. Outside the city, 40 or so Overwatch Council officials rode openly and directly toward Ming Garden under Deng Ziyu's lead. "Be careful," Fan Xian turned his head and warmly said. "No one knows who else the Juanshan Conference has left in Jiangnan." Lady Haitang's 2 hands were in the large pockets of her flowery clothing. She tilted her head and smiled. Early in the morning outside Suzhou, after the early birds chirped once, they returned to the trees to sleep. It was quiet all around the road, particularly around the beautiful and spacious Ming Garden. One could only hear the faint sound of water being poured and washing coming from inside. Everything was the same as any other day. Suddenly, dozens of riders came galloping along the road. The people on the horses were all wearing the robes of the Overwatch Council. Following the arrival of these dozens of riders outside the Ming Garden, the secret agents of the Overwatch Council who were responsible for monitoring the surroundings of the Ming Garden also appeared from the trees and behind the mountain. Some of them merged into their colleagues who had come to inspect the garden, while some of the spies disappeared without a trace. Deng Ziyu's serious face sank as he rode his horse to the front gate of Ming Garden. He flipped down from his horse. His subordinates behind him also dismounted in unison. At this moment Ming Garden was as quiet as a shy virgin. However, Deng Ziyu could clearly see that on the inner side of the low perimeter wall, there was a metallic light shining with a soul-devouring light. On the high ground to the left he could see longbows and crossbows. The other party was already waiting in formation. If they fired in unison, not a single one of these dozens of Overwatch Council officials would be able to return alive. However, Deng Ziyu's expression did not change because he believed in the commissioner's judgment. Although the Ming family were bandits in their bones, they would not be stupid enough to initiate a firefight when faced with the Overwatch Council. As expected, the front gate of Ming Garden was slowly pulled open. The young master of the Ming family, Ming Lansher, whose eyes were slightly red and who seemed to have not slept all night, stood respectfully by the gate. He spread out his right hand and said, "Everyone please. My condition this week has not been right. My writing has been rather rough. There was a chapter at the beginning that I was not very satisfied with. Everyone knows that I am a person who is easily affected by emotions. My apologies. The day before yesterday, I received news that a cousin of mine passed away. She was not more than 40 years old. I have a feeling that life is impermanent and do not need consolation. Perhaps it is relief. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 395. Report. The carriage stopped 2 streets away from the Suzhou government. The Tiger Guards cautiously watched the movements around them. An Overwatch Council secret agent wearing commoner clothing leaned over and examined the token. He moved closer to the carriage window and spoke in a quiet voice. In the carriage, Fan Xian was holding something and reading it closely. He nodded and said, "Speak." Ming Garden has not resisted. The people of the 4th Bureau have already gone in and are currently searching. For now there are no results. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said, "Pay attention to propriety. Tell Ziyu not to be too arrogant." The secret agent made a sound of acknowledgement and turned to leave the carriage, disappearing into the morning crowd in Suzhou. The carriage slowly began to move again. It had traveled half a street in the direction of the Suzhou government. Another Overwatch Council secret agent flashed out from the corner of the street and came to the side of the carriage. Lowering his voice, he reported, "There are no unusual movements at the docks." Fan Xian was silent and waved his hand to let the person go. From Hua Garden to the Suzhou government, they had to pass through half of Suzhou. Along the way, the carriage moved silently and did not attract much attention. Most of the people of Suzhou did not know that this morning, the Overwatch Council officials had already charged into Ming Garden like wolves and tigers. During this distance, the crows that the Overwatch Council had temporarily mobilized began to report news from all sides. All of the information related to the Ming family's response was gathered into this moving carriage. For example, the situation in Ming Garden, the situation of the Ming merchant house opening as usual, and the response of the governor's yamen. All of it was sent as quickly as possible into the carriage and handed over to Fan Xian for him to consider. In other words, this carriage was the central tent of the Overwatch Council's operation. Fan Xian also felt a glimmer of strangeness. Even if the Ming family was showing weakness, they could not be bullied to the point where they had not made any moves to retaliate. On the contrary, it was the governor's yamen that was beginning to grow nervous. There were already rumors of troops being mobilized. In today's plan, seeing the Ming family's response was one thing. Capturing that housekeeper Zhou was the most important. During these few days, Ming Garden had been under the Overwatch Council's close surveillance. Housekeeper Zhou should not have had any chance to escape. Most importantly, the Ming family still did not know that the news of housekeeper Zhou hiding in Ming Garden had already been grasped by the Overwatch Council. Thinking of this, a self-mocking smile rose involuntarily to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. In this world of large families, if they fought their way in from the outside, they would always be like a centipede with 100 legs. They would not die immediately, but if they fought from within, then they would face true difficulties. This was something Chao Shuiqin had said in Dream of the Red Chamber. The reason he had such a sigh now was because the place housekeeper Zhou was hiding was a member of the Ming family. A very powerful person within the Ming family had told Fan Xian through some channel. Otherwise, given the tight defenses of Ming Garden and the fact that the Overwatch Council had not successfully placed a spy from the upper echelons in a dozen years, how could they have calculated that housekeeper Zhou was in Ming Garden? As long as steward Zhou was in Ming Garden, today's matter could be considered a success. The carriage gradually approached the Suzhou government. Another secret agent from the Overwatch Council came to report some news. There was nothing else strange. The carriage entered an unremarkable little alley and leaned against a thick wall, stopping there. No one knew what it was doing. About 100 feet to the side of the Suzhou Yamen was the prison that held the prisoners. The prison killed people in the autumn and raised them in the spring. Right now, it was a time of prosperity. There were 40 to 50 people locked up in one prison. Going in through the iron gate of the prison all the way to the end of the straight path, there was a place where sunlight shone down from above, slightly warming the place and dispersing some of the dampness. Compared to the other dark and sunless prison cells, this place was much more comfortable. This prison cell was padded with hay. Under the hay one could faintly see forbidden blankets and the like. A middle-aged man was drinking alone with a deathly pale face, enjoying a treatment that normal prisoners could not enjoy. This was the fourth master of the Ming family. Because the Overwatch Council wanted to defeat the Ming family, he had become the first person to be used as a sacrifice. He had been forcefully locked up in the Suzhou government. It had already been a dozen days and there was still no news of him being let out. However, the Ming family was, after all, a large and powerful family. It was as if the Suzhou government was being raised by them. Living in the prison, there were people taking care of everything from top to bottom. His days were considered comfortable. In the prison cell next to him were a number of great bandits. They all looked at him with envious gazes. The fourth master of the Ming dynasty was too lazy to pay attention to those bandits. He only narrowed his eyes and looked at the three bailiffs outside the prison door. A mocking smile appeared at the corner of his lips and he said, "What is it today?" The prison door was opened with a clang by the bailiffs. One of the bailiffs bowed and smiled charmingly. "Fourth master, it's been hard on you these days. However, the Overwatch Council is keeping a close eye, so it's not easy for us to arrange a single room for you." The fourth master of the Ming dynasty shook his head and sighed. Being able to get out earlier is the proper thing. Did the family say anything? At this moment, two other bailiffs had already brought in good food and good wine. They laid it out in front of him, and the fragrance assailed his nostrils. The fourth master of the Ming dynasty was slightly surprised. It was not even lunchtime yet, so why had they come so early to deliver food? Suddenly he thought of something. His expression couldn't help changing dramatically. In a raspy voice he said, "What do you mean? After eating this meal you should be on your way." The bailiff sighed. The fourth master of the Ming dynasty's face was deathly pale. He didn't quite believe his ears. He thought to himself that at most he was a tyrant and did not deserve the death penalty. Furthermore, he was a member of the Ming family. How could the government dare to casually kill him? He unconsciously retreated and looked hatefully at the bailiffs. Viciously he said, "What do you mean? I don't understand." The bailiffs lowered his head slightly and said, "It is the Overwatch Council's meaning. Fourth master, please don't blame me." The fourth master of the Ming dynasty was not a foolish person. After thinking for a moment he understood the whole story. After a moment of silence, he smiled wretchedly and said, "What Overwatch Council? I'm afraid the family wants to kill me." The bailiff straightened his body and lowered his voice. "Since you understand, then don't mind it too much. It's not for the good of the family. The Overwatch Council is pressuring the family tightly. I heard they already entered the garden this morning. If we don't do something and make a ruckus, how could the Overwatch Council be willing to stop? You are the fourth master. Using your life to temporarily ensure the safety of the family for half a year is worth it." The fourth master cursed angrily, "You bastards! If you want to die, why don't you let the old matriarch die? I'll *ck her ancestors." He had already reached a moment of life and death. Of course, he knew why the Ming family would send people to kill him. This was certainly not to silence him. He had no idea about the core business of the family. This was just a stroke of ink smeared on the face of the Overwatch Council. From the end of last year, the Ming family had planned to show weakness and sorrowful battle. They needed to use the death of the fourth master of the Ming family as the opportunity to explode. Thinking of this, his heart was filled with despair, dissatisfaction, and anger. The expression of the bailiffs changed and he said, "The old matriarch is the protector of the Ming family. Fourth master, please be more respectful with your words." The fourth master smiled wretchedly and retreated to the corner of the wall. Cursing and swearing in his mouth, he said, "I am also a master of the Ming family. Why must I die? Just because I am not her biological son?" Two bailiffs had already walked to the side of the fourth master. Completely ignoring his cursing and resistance, They took out a ball of dirty rag and stuffed it into his mouth, blocking his filthy words. At the same time they tied his hands behind his back. The ruckus in the inner room had startled the entire prison. Many prisoners looked over with curiosity and fear. The leading bailiffs furrowed his brows and shouted, "The Overwatch Council is doing business. Everyone be quiet." Even though they were locked up in prison, these prisoners knew that the Overwatch Council was currently suppressing the Ming family. No one had thought that the Overwatch Council would go deep into the prison to assassinate the fourth master. They couldn't help but feel a chill in their hearts and gradually felt injustice for the Ming family. However, no one dared to glance in that direction for fear of bringing trouble upon themselves. The bailiffs looked at the plate of food in front of him and shook his head. Regretfully he said, "You can't even eat your last meal well. It has been hard on you." After saying this, he waved his hand. The two bailiffs holding the fourth master took out ropes and wrapped them around the fourth master's neck. The fourth master's neck was tied, and his face was red from the suffocation. His feet stomped endlessly on the ground, sending the hay flying everywhere and dirtying the quilt below. The ropes became tighter and tighter. The fourth master's eyes seemed to bulge out of their sockets. His nostrils flared wide. He looked strangely terrifying. The strength of his feet stomping also became weaker and weaker. He was like a dying frog bouncing weakly. One could imagine the hopelessness in the heart of the dying fourth master. One could imagine the hatred he felt toward the old woman of the Ming family in Mingqingda. However, he was already going to die. What could he do? The bailiffs looking coldly at the dying fourth master suddenly felt strange. Out of the corner of his eye, he glanced at the cell nearby. The prisoner was looking at him. The prisoner was looking at him coldly. It did not seem like he was cold-blooded watching the spectacle. There was also not a glimmer of fear. He turned around in astonishment and saw the prisoner take out something from the pile of hay and aim it at him. A crossbow. Shing shing shing. 3 crossbow noises rang out. 3 crossbow bolts flew out and accurately pierced the throats of the 3 bailiffs. The 3 of them clutched their throats. They didn't even have time to make a sound before they fell to the ground. Their feet stomped twice and they died. Once the bailiffs died, the ropes loosened. The already dying fourth master's powerless feet gradually regained strength. He slowly opened his eyes and glanced at the prisoner next door with a confused and muddy gaze. He didn't know why the other party had saved him, nor did he see clearly how the other party had saved him. The prisoner seemed to have done nothing. His eyes were looking straight ahead as he crouched by the bars. The fourth master's entire body was sore and weak. His pants were wet and smelly, but he knew he had escaped death. At this moment, the thick wall behind him, as if it was being manipulated by a ghost, quietly opened up a hole, revealing the clear blue sky outside. Agauda pulled back his long knife. His face was slightly pale. Forcefully breaking through the thick walls of the Suzhou government prison had also used up a lot of his jinchi. He entered the prison cell, picked up the fourth master with one hand and left the prison. Another Overwatch Council official entered and pulled out the crossbow bolts from the throats of the 3 bailiffs. He then carefully arranged the situation in the prison cell before walking to the side of the bars and extending his hand. The prisoner who had saved the fourth master's life earlier did not say a word. He handed the hidden crossbow in his hand to the Overwatch Council official's hand and pointed at the food box beside him. The Overwatch Council official picked up a chicken leg and placed it in his hand. The prisoner smiled with satisfaction. The Overwatch Council official lowered his voice and said, "Wait another 2 months. Sir still needs you as a witness." The prisoner nibbled on the chicken leg and nodded. Not long after the Overwatch Council official left, the prisoner flicked the rest of the chicken leg into a cell diagonally across from him. Suddenly, his face changed and he cried out in a shrill voice, "Help! Save me! Someone is killing and breaking into the prison." The carriage left the small alley behind the Suzhou government and slowly drove toward the governor's yamen. However, there was now an extra person in the carriage. The fourth master sat paralyzed in fear under the carriage chair. He raised his head to gaze at the young and handsome figure and was speechless for a moment. Fan Xian shook his head and sighed. Rich and powerful families are indeed always filthy and dirty. Shortly after, he smiled slightly and said, "Now that you've seen it clearly, I don't need to say more. In the future, you have to grasp the Ming family well and work well with the seventh master." The fourth master swallowed. The scene of him narrowly escaping death had given him too much psychological impact. It did not allow him to think at all. He nodded his head fiercely. Fan Xian said in a quiet voice, "The old matriarch wants to kill you and blame it on the Overwatch Council. She wants to spread it to the people and create an image of me as shameless and cold-blooded. She wants to stir up the emotions of the people to protect the Ming family, but now that I've saved you, she has instead blamed the Ming family for breaking into the prison. What do you think she will do? The fourth master's eyes were lifeless. He shook his head and endured the pain in his throat. In a hoarse voice he said, "Sir, don't underestimate that old B****. So, my condition is not just a problem of my mental state. I've caught a bad cold. Hissing pain. I've written less, but the quality seems to be better. My satisfaction is rising." To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 396. Regardless of whether you should be dead right now or have been kidnapped by the Ming family, Fan Xian sat in the carriage and looked outside. In a quiet voice he said, "In any case, during this period of time, it is impossible for you to appear in front of people again. The council has already arranged a place for you. Hide well and come out after this matter has settled." The fourth master weakly made a sound of acknowledgement. Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at him. He couldn't resist shaking his head. "When I asked 7th Ming to meet you, you should have agreed. Why did you have to suffer such a fright?" The fourth master gritted his teeth and said in a raspy voice, "No one would have thought that mother and son would be so ruthless." Fan Xian shook his head somewhat helplessly. For such a large family to survive, they need many sacrifices. The fourth master fell silent. His hand touched his red, tight, and aching throat. He knew that he was nothing more than a sacrifice and didn't have much right to ask for anything. When the carriage was halfway through its original journey, another carriage picked up the fourth master from Fan Xian's carriage. Only Fan Xian and a few people from the Qinian unit were left in the carriage. The 7 tiger guards followed Gao Da's arrangement and scattered around the carriage, concealing their tracks. "Sir, where do we go next?" the subordinate asked in a low voice. Fan Xian thought for a bit and then said, "Wait another hour and send an invitation to the governor's manor. I want to see Xueqing again." His gaze landed on the subordinate's face and asked, "Has the arrangement in the prison been completed?" The subordinate said in a low voice, "Yes. Furthermore, the Suzhou government has people watching. The Ming family cannot escape the crime of breaking into the prison. Only speak directly." Fan Xian furrowed his brows. "I don't understand. If the Ming family wanted to kill the 4th Ming master and frame the council, there was no need to do it so exaggerated." Fan Xian shook his head. "The method is not important. What is important is the timing. Today the Overwatch Council entered the Ming garden to search. The 4th master died in the prison. No matter how he died or how the Ming family arranged the aftermath, as long as he died and someone found his body, all of the Jiangnan gentry and common people would think it was me who did it." He smiled and said, "The Ming family have been waiting for me to lose my patience and enter the Ming garden so they could throw out this abandoned pawn. However, now that the 4th Ming disciple is not dead, I am truly curious. How will the Ming family continue to play the tragic card?" The carriage slowly came to a stop. The morning sunlight of Suzhou City gently and warmly shone on the long street, shining on people's hearts, and then on the roof of this black 4-wheeled carriage, as if to brush away the coldness in the hearts of the people sitting inside. Estimating that Ming garden was already in a commotion, Fan Xian lifted the curtain and got off the carriage. The tiger guards gathered around and walked toward the tall governor's yamen. An official of the Overwatch Council had already handed over a name card, so the yamen gatekeeper did not dare to stop them. An advisor hurriedly walked out and welcomed them in. It was still in that study. There was still only Governor Xueqing and Imperial Envoy Fan Xian. Fan Xian very straightforwardly expressed his intentions and informed the other party that the Overwatch Council people had already entered Ming Garden. Hearing this reality that had already happened, the corners of Governor Xueqing's eyes furrowed imperceptibly. He then sighed and slowly said, "There are many things that cannot be done quickly. Going down to Jiangnan to deal with the Ming family was the Qing Emperor's established policy. Fan Xian was only a specific executor. As the Emperor's trusted aide, Xueqing knew the origins of this matter. However, in terms of specific measures, he was very different from Fan Xian. The court did not set a timetable for taking in the Ming family. For the Emperor, he believed he still had a lot of time and enough patience to slowly eat up the large clans in Jiangnan. Correspondingly, Xueqing did not want to act in too much of a hurry. He had always been conciliatory in order to avoid making too much of a ruckus, messing up Jiangnan and shaking the foundation of the court's rule. Thus, Xueqing's mood was not very good regarding the matter of Fan Xian directly entering the yamen and saying he had already entered Ming Garden. He still did not understand why Fan Xian was in such a rush. He was clearly a young noble not even 20 years old. What was there to be afraid of wasting a few years? There was another glimmer of anger in his chest. He understood that Fan Xian's action was to force him onto the boat to take a knife. The Overwatch Council had already entered Ming Garden. If the two sides fought as the governor of Jiangnan rode, he had to ensure peace no matter what. Then he had to do what he needed to do. A few days ago, Xueqing had not relented because he did not have much confidence in dealing with the Ming family. Furthermore, he was afraid of the rumors in the capital. Now that he had been played by Fan Xian, his anger gradually rose. In a low voice he said, "If trouble arises, who will be responsible?" Fan Xian thought quietly for a moment and then seriously said, "There shouldn't be any trouble." Xueqing glanced at him coldly and said, "It's not that I'm being arrogant, but no matter how you look at it, I am still one of your elders. You didn't handle this matter carefully enough. The Ming family has already shown weakness for half a year, waiting for you to bully them. Now that you have already bullied their way in, how could they miss this opportunity?" Fan Xian shook his head. "Once we've entered Ming Garden, what can they do?" Xueqing lowered his eyelids slightly and said, "Although the court has always known that the Ming family keeps 1,000 private soldiers, they have always turned a blind eye to the service they have performed for the court. It was not difficult for a large family of tens of thousands of people to use all kinds of names to raise 1,000 private soldiers." However, Fan Xian couldn't help smiling coldly when he heard these words. "Is it for the court or for the Juanshan Conference?" Hearing the words Juanshan Conference, Xueqing fell silent. For such a mysterious and limitless power organization to appear in the Jiangnan under his rule, it had to be said that he had failed in his duty. The emperor had already severely reprimanded him in the secret letter he had sent. Xueqing understood that Fan Xian was using the name of the Juanshan Conference to pressure him. He could only helplessly shake his head and say, "Where exactly are your plans?" Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "The Ming family was prepared to kill the fourth Ming disciple and plant it on the Overwatch Council. I stopped this matter." "In the Suzhou government?" Xueqing was slightly startled. Only now did he understand why Fan Xian appeared to have a card up his sleeve. 1,000 private soldiers. As long as the Ming family does not raise the flag and rebel, I will only send 40 people in and they won't dare to move. Fan Xian continued to smile slightly and said, "Don't they like to play retreat in order to advance? I want to see just how far they can retreat." Xueqing half closed his eyes and said, "They really won't dare to move? What you have is not an imperial edict." Fan Xian responded with equal harshness, "I have not taken an imperial edict, but I have the emperor's sword." Xueqing lightly said, "As long as a few more people die in the Ming Garden and adjust their emotions, it is not impossible for them to bury your 40 Overwatch Council secret agents in the Ming Garden." The emperor's sword? The Ming Garden can find enough excuses to argue that they did not know of this and only thought that Sir Fan Jr. of the Overwatch Council wanted to kill and steal property, so they were forced to retaliate. Don't forget, the Ming family has laid the groundwork very well these few months. For something like this to happen at this time, everyone under heaven will believe them. These words stabbed into Fan Xian's heart. If the Ming family was truly forced into a corner, it was not as if they could not do such a crazy thing. Given the Ming family's foundation in Jiangnan and support in the capital, they could completely shed all pretenses of cordiality with Fan Xian. Furthermore, the Overwatch Council had entered the Ming Garden first. Even if the two sides fought openly, public opinion would completely fall on the Ming family's side. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian did not seem to care about this at all. There was not a trace of emotion on that young and handsome face. Xueqing couldn't help but furrow his brows. Fan Xian finally opened his mouth. There was a faint self-mockery at the corner of his lips. "The Ming family is waiting for me to act and I am also waiting for the Ming family to act. As long as we shed all pretenses, if they actually dare to touch my subordinates no matter what, I will frame them as rebelling. Regardless of whether the people under heaven believe it or not, I will place this hat on the head of that old Ming matriarch." To say such a perverted thing in front of the governor, Fan Xian could not be said to not be daring. However, his following words made Xueqing feel a glimmer of coldness. Naturally, no one would believe they would rebel. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, However, once we act, the Black Knights that have been staying in Jiangbei will come. I will kill everyone in the Ming Garden. As long as everyone in the 6th branch is dead, who will cry out for them? The Jiangnan people or the Jiangnan gentry? He continued to calmly say, even if they cry out for their grievances all the way to Jingdo, so what? Even if they file a lawsuit before the emperor, so what? I have killed everyone in the 6th branch. There is only Xia Qifei left. At most, there will be the 4th Ming prince as an ornament. The court will still have the Ming family property in their hands. As long as the goal is reached, it doesn't matter if the methods are dirty. He turned his head and stared into Xue Qing's eyes. I trust that if 40 people of the Overwatch Council died and I moved the Black Knights to Suzhou, you wouldn't still stop me, would you? Xue Qing's pupils constricted slightly. If things really developed like this and the Overwatch Council threw in 40 officials, and he still had to forcefully stop the Black Knights from going south, he was afraid that the Overwatch Council would truly fly into a rage and anger the old man in the wheelchair. Even if he was the governor, he probably wouldn't have a good end. Looking at Fan Xian's warm and pure eyes, Xue Qing felt an inexplicable chill in his heart. He had a completely new understanding of the young official beside him. It turned out that Commissioner Fan of the Overwatch Council was indeed a powerful figure who killed without blinking. The way the younger generation did things was indeed sufficiently crazy. What about you? After massacring Ming Garden, Fan Xian would not have a good ending. However, Xue Qing still did not believe that Sir Fan Jr. would gamble with the Ming family on this. Me? At most, I'll have all my titles removed, lose my official position, and be demoted to a commoner, at the very least, banished 3,000 li away? Fan Xian seemed to be thinking about his own end and laughed out loud. It's not like you don't know. I can go anywhere in the world. Xue Qing couldn't resist shaking his head and sighing. Then the 40 subordinates you sent into Ming Garden, were they all abandoned? Fan Xian closed his eyes and shook his head. Not so. I'm only talking about the worst ending. However, I believe that given the shrewdness of the mother and son of the Ming family, they would certainly not make such a choice. Thus, I am very curious. How exactly is the Ming family prepared to deal with this? It's like playing cards. I don't think I'm going to win this round, but I'm very curious as to what card my opponent is going to play. He opened his eyes and said with a smile, sometimes, I have the curiosity of a gambler. I am also beginning to become curious. Xue Qing's eyelids jumped slightly. I hope your judgment is not wrong. The Juanshan Conference accountant surnamed Zhou is still in Ming Garden. Don't worry. Fan Xian encouraged the governor. I have people in Ming Garden. Xue Qing furrowed his brows. He didn't know who exactly Fan Xian was hiding in Ming Garden. Given his identity, it was not convenient for him to ask, so he closed his mouth and didn't say anything more. The 2 leading figures of the Jiangnan officials sat silently in the study, waiting for news from Ming Garden. They didn't have to wait for long before the news came. The advisor of the governor's manor moved closer to Xue Qing's side and whispered for a while. Xue Qing fell silent. He then gazed at Fan Xian and sighed. The cards the other party has played seem to have exceeded your expectations. I'm going to start moving troops. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. Xue Qing continued to smile bitterly and said, moving troops is for the safety of your subordinates and not to prevent you from massacring the garden. Xue Qing knew he didn't need to explain it to him in detail. His face was still full of shock as he hurriedly left the study. Fan Xian stood and heard the whole story from the mouth of the Qinian unit member outside the door. The Overwatch Council's news should be faster than the governor's manners. After all, he was in the manor, so the message was sent slower. After Fan Xian heard of what happened in Ming Garden, he still couldn't help but be like Governor Xue Qing. A shocked expression appeared on his face. His mouth opened slightly and he sighed, ruthless, even more ruthless than what I did. He was prepared to curse out to vent the absurd feeling in the depths of his heart. In the end he endured it. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. His expression gradually became calm. He then gave out an order. Have Deng Ziyu pull everyone back. Don't retaliate when hit. Don't retaliate when scolded. The official of the Qinian unit accepted the order and left. Fan Xian followed him out of the door of the governor's yamen. He saw that the inside of the yamen was a mess. Most of the officials who didn't know the inside story looked at each other. They didn't know why the governor had chosen this time to inspect the governance of the city and why he had called all of the military officials in the city into the manor to discuss matters. Fan Xian had the right to participate in the discussion, but he knew that it was not suitable for him to stay in the governor's manor. The storm that was about to arrive would have to be dealt with by Sir Xueqin, while he should go and do other things. Climbing into the carriage, Fan Xian rubbed the space between his brows and suddenly said something to Tiger Guard Gouda that had no head or tail. Actually, a lot of the time, how a matter goes is completely dependent on the order of the people who die. Gouda paused. He didn't understand what the commissioner was talking about. Fan Xian scratched his head and said, "Clearly I want him to die. If he kills himself before I let him die, then will actually have problems." "Who died?" Gouda furrowed his brows and asked. "The great-grandmother in the eyes of the Jiangnan people, the old matriarch of the Ming family who has saved countless poor people," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. Because she couldn't stand the humiliation of the Overwatch Council entering the garden and Sir Fan Jr.'s many days of oppression, she angrily hanged herself this morning. The old Ming matriarch killed herself? Gouda sank into shock. Although he was from Jingdo, he knew what kind of prestige and position this old ancestor of the Ming family had in the entirety of Jiangnan. Using death to demonstrate her will, Fan Xian laughingly scolded. Ming Qingda is truly ruthless, even more ruthless than his mother. In reality, the old Ming matriarch did not want to die. Of course, this was nonsense. No one in this world wanted to die. Even though the old Ming matriarch was already old and her breath of life had flowed out for many years, she had enough of enjoying her life in Jiangnan, but she still did not want to die. The Ming family's reputation in Jiangnan was very good. They had done countless good deeds such as opening shops, giving out porridge and sponsoring students. In people's hearts, this old Ming matriarch was like a benevolent old immortal in the clouds. Her entire body was wrapped in a sweet and glowing clothing. It was to the extent that among the Jiangnan people and even in some remote places, there were people who had begun to erect shrines for this old Ming matriarch. It was clear that the old Ming matriarch did not connect the shrines to her lifespan. She also did not think that since the shrines had been erected, how many more days could she, or should she live? Recently, all of her attention had been focused on dealing with the Overwatch Council's all-pervasive coercion. She had long drawn up a corresponding plan. On this beautiful morning, hearing that the Overwatch Council secret agents had entered the garden to search, the old woman's face was filled with anger. She cursed, "After Ming Garden was built, how could there be a government search? Even if the governor enters the manor, he has to maintain etiquette. These bastards of the Overwatch Council." The little courtyard she lived in was far away in the deepest part of Ming Garden. She could not hear the clamor of the Overwatch Council searching in front of her. However, this feeling of humiliation still made her angry. Narrowing her eyes, she said, "You plan to let our family be bullied like this?" Standing beside her was the current master of the Ming family in name, the eldest son of the eldest branch, Ming Qingda. His face was slightly ashen. He knew what his mother meant and replied in a small voice, "He has already gone. However, after all, fourth is still a brother." The old Ming matriarch glanced at her son coldly and with disgust. She thought, if you are not ruthless, how can you accomplish great things? How can you allow your family to struggle at death's door under the Overwatch Council's powerful attacks and endure until the day the capital turns the tables? You have to be ruthless. The old Ming matriarch lectured. Ming Qingda glanced at his mother's wrinkled face. A filial smile appeared on his face and he made a sound of acknowledgement. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.